She hasn't signed on yet. That's what Jen and I were just trying to talk about.
So I guess we won't know how the sound is until she's
And Jen can hear it perfectly. She's having no problems remotely seeing the screens, hearing any of the sounds, anything like that.
Can we hear Jen?
Yes.
Hey, Jen.
Hey, Heather.
I bet you were on mute, weren't you?
I was. It looks like Omar.
Well, I understand. It's always good. I just want to make sure that you can hear us and we can hear you, because then when Jamel comes on, it should be the same, right?
Beneficial. So I think it's important to mention that Mary.
It's a good. Omar Khan, the cartel investigator or being investigator.
She's interested.
Say that once again. It kind of got a weird echo.
I would call it a program.
Omar Khan.
That during which we were collecting them. Because when you say that they were engaged in research, they are now. Right? So I think this with the school.
Omar, can you hear me?
That's what my
We can hear you. There's some kind of weird echo that's making it pretty jumbled.
that was like legal.
That's what I did.
Can you hear us?
I just sent it to me.
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay. That's what she did. She's like, but I don't work for it. I'm like, but you're affiliated, so it should be okay.
I would say it would be fine. Based on what I have.
Okay.
Dr. Ellis, I am on the call.
Hi.
Yeah. I was saying 15 years.
We switched.
That's all right.
I wanted to switch it up.
So that's good.
We have an idea.
That's what she did.
What we do.
I'm okay right here. I didn't know how full.
I'm going to swing through here just because
As
I
we're
want to
developing
disturb them.
chemistry,
She looks much too comfortable.
the same elements that you're using with your study. What I mean by that is, wouldn't it be neat?
So Lindsay's going to be late.
And put.
So we're going to start with that.
James is not here.
Okay. We were hoping to have the ACE awardees from last year come today for a reunion. I want to say this we contacted them back in September to say we wanted to do this. We had several people who were going to come that had to, cancel at the last minute, which holidays and what have you. So I decided that because we couldn't get a good showing, I was just going to cancel that. We have that hour at the end. What I propose to do, because I feel like it got chopped up, is we will come back to research questions and working on specific games. If you really feel like you want to take that hour to do something else with your team, just let me know, because then I'll plan, depending on how many teams I have, how much time per team. We will still be done by noon and get you guys all moving along. And so I don't know. I mean, to be honest with you, I may try and reschedule it. Maybe what I'll do, actually, where's Lee? He walked out for a second. I'll have Lee send something out to you guys, whether or not you think it's worth, doing, trying to squeeze in maybe in January or not. I think it would have been nice for networking and to learn a little bit, and it would have been fun, but I don't know if we need to force it or not. I know that everybody's busy, eager to get done and move on with your project. So we're going to get started. I will just do a brief introduction. I don't even know, now. I was thinking about that. I'm like, how did I initially even meet Barrett? It's been a long time now. Yeah. Hey, Mr. Brian.
Probably. Or Deb.
Yeah. Oh, it might have been that way too. So, some of you, I don't know if you know, but Dr. Mikulik is a professor at the University of Delaware, as are some of our audience participants. He is a medical sociologist, and so we've interfaced on a couple of projects that way, and we interface on the CTR, as he is one of the leads for evaluation for the CTR. But what I kind of first came to know Barrett, as a qualitative researcher, and he's really helped me greatly on projects and thinking about this stuff, and I think we've had a lot of fun working together. And he gives a great talk, and he will kind of be nuts and bolts today, and then comes back to us to do sort of more specifics, sort of a more tailored, what do you want to talk about approach. And I think it's fair to say in the past you've been very much like, interrupt me with questions as I go. And
yeah, any questions you have as we move forward, just feel free to raise your hand or just shout them out. That's pretty small. Thank you, Heather, of course. So I'm Barrett. Michael is my last name. I'm over at UD Department of Soc. I teach a class in advanced qualitative methods at the graduate level, which is focused on coding and analysis and writing it up, which a lot of people don't get a lot of practice in. So, but this specific today will do mostly like, here are qualitative methods. Here's interviewing, here's focus groups, here's what the nuts and bolts, advantages, disadvantages. And then there's some time in there to talk about your own projects, any questions you may have related to that. Just to get a kind of feel, how familiar is everyone with qualitative methods? Fairly good. They exist. There we go. Okay, good. Okay, that's good. Yeah, some people feel like I can do an interview, I can do a focus group, and then they like, get in there and they realize, wait, this is a lot harder than I thought. I'm like, where do I start? So we're going to go through that. I use this kind of picture of the shedding its skin is kind of gross, but it's how I view the idea of qualitative methods and how they can be used. A lot of times we're locked in a mindset of a quantitative mindset, like there is a direct way of doing something. If I have a particular data set, I know I use this statistical analysis and I'll get this outcome, and that's great. Qualitative methods are not the exact opposite, but pretty close. So you kind of got to shed your skin a little bit, kind of what you're used to, in order to get into the qualitative mindset field. I'm a little kind of organic, grassroots kind of idea about qualitative methods. It may be a little too touchy-feely for some people, but we'll see what we get to. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about my background, some initial thoughts I have about qualitative methods in general. We'll go over kind of the traditional methods, interviews, focus groups, content analysis, participant observation, PAR research, participatory action research. And then we'll talk a little bit about approaching your own qualitative research, what you're doing, and talk about data gathering. We'll stop there. The next time I come in January, we'll talk about how to code it and then how to write it up, all right, which is kind of the more interesting or hands-on part. So my own background, I went to Emory as an undergrad, then East Carolina for graduate school, and then back to Emory for my PhD. And so I got the fundamentals in particular classes, but nothing grandiose. And actually, it wasn't until I did my own dissertation, my own work in the field, that I actually understood what qualitative methods were all about. I did interviews, observations, and content analysis. And it wasn't until I actually engaged in those practices that I actually knew what qualitative methods could be and how to do them. So a lot of times I talk about the idea of you don't really know qualitative methods until you go into the field and actually engage in them and do them consistently. Various projects, like Heather was mentioning, that I've done in the past with Christiana, but also Thomas Jefferson at UD, that engage focus groups, interviews. So I have a lot of practice, and again, I teach classes in the stuff. So I feel pretty confident in my ability to teach others about how to do them. If you're interested but hesitant with qualitative methods, oh, I've gone too far. Or if you don't know how to use this thing, where did I go? Where was I? Was I up or was I down? There we go. There's some interesting books that are not by sociologists or researchers per se, but more by what I'll call kind of social commentators. There's a book called Rats. I know it sounds terrible, but it's a history of rats in New York City, Manhattan, and this guy actually does an observation analysis of rats in one particular alley in Manhattan for a year. And actually, oddly enough, it's during the time when 9/11 happens, and so he didn't know. So it's really interesting, but it's an observation, and you're like, wow, this is an actual observation exercise. Down in Their Luck is about homeless in Austin, Texas. That's actually done by sociologists, which is an interesting part. Into the Valley is a book about socialization of death for med students, written by Fred Hafferty back in the early 90s, great piece. And then Among the Thugs is about soccer hooligans in London, so Manchester United fans, and this guy follows them around, gets into some trouble. But these are all great kind of sociology, non-sociology books that if you're interested, great reads, easy reads. It gives you an idea of how to do qualitative methods from a fun perspective. Initial thoughts, qualitative methods are extremely reading and writing intensive. If you think that you can do interviews because they're easier, or focus groups because, I'll just get it done, it'll be easy. Qualitative methods are easier than quantitative methods. Forget that mindset. Yeah, forget it. It is. I think it's more difficult to code and analyze qualitative data than quantitative. That's my own perspective. A difficult thing to get your mind around with qualitative methods is there's not one right way all the time. There's not one right method to do qualitative methods for a particular project, and not one particular way to actually analyze qualitative data. And that can be difficult for people to understand. There's some degree of self-teaching with qualitative methods that engage in practice. Heavy focus on critical and original thought. You have to really be somewhat creative when you're using qualitative methods. And you have to be somewhat sensitive and vulnerable. This is another hard thing for people to understand. You have to let the data kind of talk to you rather than you putting your own imprint on the data. And that can be very difficult. Again, it's that idea of shedding your skin. Not all of you will be good at qualitative research. I'm not trying to say that to be mean, but some of you will have a sensitivity or a feel or a touch that will allow you a kind of a greater ability to get into the data. Again, it can come with practice, just like empathy. You can practice it, you can engage it just like a foreign language. All right, but some of you may get really frustrated in the beginning. Just keep on practicing, it'll work. Get outside of yourself, battle a traditional mindset, push yourself out of your comfort zone. When you're doing observations or doing interviews, we'll talk about this, you have to find a way to train with the monkey mind from the Buddhist kind of scriptures, right? The idea of you're going to have so much coming at you. I mean, you can imagine, if you just did a participant observation just right now, just sat down and just kind of engage in observation right now, you have so much data coming at you all at once. How do you filter all that out and really focus on what your kind of research questions are? You have to learn to train that way, that mind. Taking a step further and digging deeper, what I find, and we'll go over this the next time I come back, what I find with a lot of my grad students is that they go and they code this wonderful, rich interview data or observation data, and what they do is they just stop right at the surface level. Like, oh, here's what they said. Oh, but there's so much more. There's so much more that you gotta dig deeper, get deeper with it. Just don't get that surface level, kind of that cream on the top. There's much more. And then we'll talk a little bit about this today. Your body, yourself as a filter. Your body is actually impacting the data. So you have to understand how you as a researcher impact the data you are getting. We'll go over that a little bit today. Okay. I'm hitting too many buttons here. Okay. Initial thoughts in terms of quantitative and qualitative research. So it's not an either or. Sometimes people think about it as I'm either doing this or I'm doing that. Either I'm doing a survey and a statistical analysis or I'm doing interview data. You can use them both. All right. Hopefully some of you are doing mixed methods approach. Right. It's not an either or. They just have different approaches and they focus on different things. Right. So don't think of it as quantitative or qualitative. Think of it as quantitative and qualitative. All right. So let's get into types of methods. The types of methods that you can use for qualitative, kind of the one that everyone tends to use that's not really a method, is qualitative description. It's basically painting the picture. The idea, if you're kind of in a setting, you're doing an observation, right, and you're kind of just talking about what all is happening around you, right? That's not really a method. You're not really getting data. It's just describing, just kind of understanding the description of the setting. That can be very important. It can be essential. Right? It can really talk a lot about your audience and about your sample and your participants, but it's not like an actual method, right? That's probably not what a lot of you are doing or describing, unless you were going to go in and talk about particular types of institutions and the environment, right? And you wanted to know learning environments. Like some people have done this in terms of prisons or hospitals, talking about the colors on the walls, the painting, the art that's used, and what kind of messages that sends students or prisoners or things like that. Right, that could be where qualitative description would be quite good. Right, but otherwise, when you're doing interviews with people, you may want to engage in this kind of practice just to begin to get your mind in the right space. So start talking about it. If you're interviewing somebody right before they get there about 20 minutes early, 30 minutes early. Start getting your mind in the right headspace. Start mapping out what the place looks like and how that may have an impact on what's going on. What's the temperature? What do you feel like? Right? What are your nerves? What are you thinking about? All these things. Start thinking about that kind of mindset. Describe the scenario and the situation. It's straight up description, right? Comprehensive sum of events and everyday terms and events. It's surface level, right? You can get in thick description, talking about every little thing, the kind of textures on the walls, what type of light is being used, right? These types of things. It's not lazy or bad. It's just it's a good exercise. It's a good practice. And one of the things to think about is oftentimes we take that base level description for granted when we're doing research. Yes?
Why do you say not necessarily lazy or they describe this as lazy or
Because you could just stop there, right? So if you were doing participant observation let's say, and I always use this, like this is an example I use with my students. Let's say you were doing a study on interactions in nightclubs, something like that. And so you're going ahead and you're describing just the nightclub, right? There's mirrors on the wall, there's couches, this kind of stuff. If you went that as far as you went, you haven't told me anything about interactions or how that environment may actually be impacting interactions. How are the individuals using those props in that particular setting? So it would kind of be, it would be lazy just to describe the props, kind of be given the thick description. That's it. And actually, a lot of people engage in this. You have to get into the actual interactions and how people are interacting with those kind of social things around them. Okay? So don't stop there, basically.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the thing. Go deeper. And even like I said, you don't want to take it for granted. It's always good to have it, but it's not far enough.
Got it.
All right, interviews. These are probably, how many of you guys are going to be using interviews? A lot of you, yeah. That's usually the number one. That or focus groups are usually the bigger ones, right? So interviews, respondents ask a series of questions related to the research project. Interviewer leads all respondents over the same issues, but may not ask the same questions to the same people. Of course not, right? You may have certain people that are answering the questions that you have on your interview guide that IRB approved, but oh, right, this is awesome. Someone's taking me in this particular direction. This is exactly what I want to talk about, right? So you start asking questions related to that aren't on your interview guide. IRB understands that, right? We're going in a particular direction. Not everyone gets the same types of questions. You all know the difference between structured, semi-structured, and unstructured. But unstructured basically means you don't really have an interview guide. Kind of goes wherever it wants to go. Semi-structured, you have an interview guide, but you're going to go off in certain directions. Completely structured, you have an interview guide, you're sticking specifically to those questions. Yeah.
In planning,
Yes.
give me some sense of when you choose to be more structured versus when you're going to, say this is the kind of thing where I'm going to walk into the group and maybe ask one question and let it go.
Well, so if you're doing one-on-one interviews, especially in the beginning, or any project, I would always choose to go semi-structured before structured or anything like that, especially if it's something new or it's an area that hasn't really been explored, if there isn't a lot of research on it. I think one of the best things you can do is, of course, using previous research, let that guide kind of your research questions and things like that, your interview questions. But at the same time, you want to go in there, if it hasn't been talked about, especially in a new area, you want the people to speak to you. You want them to tell you what's going on and what's happening. You don't want to tell them, hey, I want to know this specific thing. Also, something to think about, do you show your cards? Some people walk in with interview questions and boom, there's you just let your research out right there. You have to be a little bit more maybe suave and savvy about how you're going to ask your questions so as not to really give a whole project away, because you want them to talk about something that might be a little sensitive, and you're going to go out there and be like, boom, this is I want to know right now. You can't do that. You got to kind of ease them into it. So sensitive types of questions, you're going to go very semi-structured, perhaps even unstructured. Let them kind of talk about things and give them a big general topic, and then start asking questions related to that. How many of you are dealing with sensitive samples? Okay, so those types of things, you want to have questions that you want to get to, some ideas that you want to get to, but that's going to be hard to really talk to people about those things.
Structured when I had theoretical framework and I couldn't just wean off. So simply, these are the questions according to theory of planned behavior I have to ask. Here you go. You can't really go off, because if they do, then I'm collecting unnecessary data. So
there's never such thing as unnecessary data.
And
No,
because but depending if because we were developing items for scale, so it would go on and on. And
exactly.
It just was unnecessary. It was unnecessary for the purpose of the study. If it were to describe phenomenon, that would be one thing. But for that.
If you are using kind of theory to guide your research, right? If you're gonna do specifically, I'm gonna theory test, then yes, you're gonna have a much more structured. I won't say 100% structured, but probably much more structured approach. I tend to engage in areas that haven't been that studied, so I try not to do that too much. Again, it's not bad. Totally not bad. But that's my thing. So all my research is semi-structured. Just because I like to see what else, because there's always going to be something I'm not going to know, and I hope so. Right? I hope so. There's that quote that was told me back when I was in grad school, like, I hope you don't find what you're looking for. right? Because when you don't find what you're looking for, then you're like, yeah, oh, this is something completely new, although it does screw you up in terms of timetables and getting research done. But then you're like, oh, wait, this is something new. This is something new. So think about that when you're designing your research questions. If you're theory-driven, very deductive, right, you're going to want to have a more structured approach, and you want to stick people to timetables. But also think about your sample. If you have people that are community members that are going to want to engage in having a conversation. One of the issues that I've had with, not an issue, not a bad thing, at a project on Medical Home Without Walls with Susan Smollett, and we've had people come in, patients come in and talk about their experiences, and it was almost like a tell-all. I didn't even know where to start with some of with the coding, because I'm like, this has nothing to do. Like, the question was, how is it going for you? Love it. Let me tell you about 1,000 other things that's happening in my life. And so we found all these other elements. Was that?
I said, it's kind of like my world. That's like the world of a doctor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. I think we get that. Yeah.
Okay, with one problem, but it's
I was really wanted to know about this, but now I know it. So it was great, and we didn't learn a ton more about the actual program from these people. We did learn a lot about these types of patients and their lives. So that was great. And so now we have other areas to go in terms of research. But in terms of thinking about other things you want to go into, with interviews, you can go in depth on issues, right? The respondents can let you know, so you have to know your sample. You might have people that are pressed for time, so they may just be giving you one-word answers, two-word answers, that kind of stuff. You got to know how to move the interview along with your sample. It can be time-consuming. Be ready to sit down with people for an hour sometimes. It can, depending upon how many people you want in your sample, it depends on how big your sample is, like how big your population would be in terms of people you want to study. It can be a lot of money. How many of you that are doing interviews are planning on transcribing them yourself? Students? Okay. Okay. That's always a good way. You get undergrads to do it, of course. That's always a good way of doing it. I tend to pay people to do it just so it gets done in an hour. Otherwise, with students, you never know what you're going to get. And then sometimes you have to reread.
Do you actually get students to do this for free?
Yeah, sometimes. Sometimes I give them a few bucks. Yeah.
I pay them.
I have a lot of pre-meds that want like help on. They want to be on research projects, and so I'm like, here, do this. But I don't trust them. I hate to say it. I don't.
So they
trust
do
them.
it as part of you being on the research project. It's
Yeah.
not like they
I'll
just
put that in
do it.
myself.
Okay.
Yeah, or sometimes they'll just do it, or they'll write a response paper, something like that.
You have to check it. I mean, if
yeah.
you have additional labor,
Exactly.
you have to go through.
That's why I don't trust them. Yeah. So I tend to
some
use.
People are great, and some people really don't know what. It's not just not their skill.
When you use a professional service, it helps.
I've used the online GMS or whatever, GMAS.
You turned me on to
something.
one group
Yeah.
that I use now
I
for
thought they were
$1 per survey, $1 per hour, no, $1 per minute, whatever it is. But it's awesome. I mean, the professional services, in my opinion, are worth the money. So anytime I'm on a grant.
What are you using for, if you were to go, if you don't have students to do it, where would you go?
I have the name of the service. I can't remember it right now. I can tell you when we finish up. I'll just look at my email and I'll find it for you.
Do you remember the service that we used for? No.
I think
I could dig through my email too.
I remember it's a gray and red logo. That's all I can
And it
remember.
has a G in it.
It's like it's always good for grants, like.
Yeah, exactly. I always build it in.
If you have it as
exactly.
an item, then
I
you
always
can do
build
that.
it in. Exactly. Because then it's done. It only takes 24 hours and it's done. It's in your hand, and then you can code it immediately. When you use students, even grad students, it can get hairy. All right. So you want it done professionally. You want it done, so that you're not going to mess with IRB or anything like that in terms of confidentiality. This is always a good way to go. Again, it costs a lot of time, costs your money, all right? Limited sample. If you're doing interviews, you may only be able to get 10 to 15, maybe 20, depending upon your time. So your sample may be limited, all right? But you could get very rich data. Can never be anonymous because you are going to do that face-to-face, so the researchers are always going to know who the person is. Can be confidential, but can be anonymous. And I get dinged on this every time I use qualitative methods in a clinically minded journal. Right, so sociology journals, they don't mind it, but more clinically minded journals, they're saying this is one person's account of one event, right? Even if you have 15, right? This data cannot be representative. It's a difference in terms of understanding of qualitative methods and what they do. So just understand that you may run into hurdles in terms of reviewers and what's going on. Difficulties with interviews, the boundaries of the study, the substantive frame. What you may be studying could shift during the interview process. You could find out that what you thought you were looking at is actually something very different. So you have to be ready, right? You have to be mobile, you have to be vulnerable, you have to be open to understanding that if you're studying personal experience, that experience might be very different than what you thought. Maybe not too different, but even slightly, and it may open you up to other avenues that you have to explore. And also in turn change who you may have to interview. That's happened to me in a few studies where I'm interviewing a particular group, and they're talking about the influence of a whole other group that I had thought about, I thought was important, but not that important, and now I had to go talk to them because I got to know what they think of the situation as well. Know your study's audience. So understand who you're writing for. What's the end goal of your paper? Right? Do you want to affect policy? Who's going to read that? Who's going to read your report? So what kind of information do they need in your report? So what kind of questions? That's going to impact the questions that you're going to ask as well. Right? You may be interested in something, but I always run against this as well. Whoever is going to be reading this report, they might want to know specifics about their program that you have to ask that you may not be interested in. Value in using work of others to back up your efforts in terms of research questions, but also who you're interviewing, and then getting in. Think about how you are getting in with that sample. It's one of the harder parts. We'll talk about getting out in a second. That can be even harder. But getting in, who is your kind of gatekeeper? How many are you already in with your sample? How many have a direct contact with your sample? You can get in, interview who you need to.
Can you clarify the question?
So let's say you're a doctor and you're going to interview patients. Do you feel you have a direct contact with this patient population or patient sample that you need and feel comfortable talking with them? Okay. Okay, so so if you're talking about community members or students, right, same kind of thing. You feel that you can get in, no problem, they know who you are, they won't be kind of taken aback by the idea of you doing a study. All right, that can be something to think about. If you haven't already done that, think about how you're going to ease yourself in. Specifically, if you're going to do observations, and if you're going to do interviews, you're asking for people for their time. How many people are going to give their participants some kind of compensation? Okay, so that's an enticing thing, but some people don't do that. All right, you got to think about how you're going to get in. How are you going to get people to come in? I've seen so many projects come from people that want to do interviews or observations. They get to the point of ready to go in the field, and no one will talk to them because they haven't presented themselves in a way of actually easing into the samples world. Right? There's a difference, and we'll go over that kind of power difference in a second. Should you show your cards when you ask your questions? Should you let them know exactly what the study is about? Now, your informed consent will probably have some information about that. Who knows how many samples or how many people actually read the informed consent before they sign it, right? Are you going to tell them exactly what the project is about, or do you want a broad scope of what the project is about so you can ask more specific questions? Think about that when designing.
As a qualitative researcher, tell me, you've mentioned how it's important to be open to changing your procedures and the way the project is going and what you're collecting. But from my perspective, I always find it difficult when I have to communicate with RB. Oh, by the way, I decided to change my samples. And I think, so do you always resubmit? We have both at UD. Do you always resubmit for amendment and RB? So you have to really keep on going with that and rolling with that.
Exactly. So the last project I did this was on a study on minority pre-medical students, and my sample, I realized that I was going to have to include faculty members and staff who advise, and I hadn't included that in my original IRB. It was just students in my original IRB, and so within 10 interviews, I realized I got to change this. So amendment, and here's a new list of questions. I feel like at UD, it's a fairly quick turnaround. But it could be an issue with other IRBs. So you may, in your original proposal, just be as broad as you possibly can. Maybe you don't use that sample, but so doing your legwork beforehand when you're designing the study is a big deal. But yeah, I just throw amendments.
That's why I feel it's so laborious because of that. Because any kind of change, here I have to again.
That's why I have a graduate student on projects. Usually, it's always be like, here, do it.
Okay.
I mean, but if you don't, it's all you, then it's just a case of. This is one of the major issues with qualitative studies. They are so time intensive that you are taking yourself out of the game for a good amount of time in terms of getting more papers out. Now, you may build enough of a data bank so you'll have study after study to do, but you're taking yourself out. It's going to affect your teaching or your other responsibilities in terms of work and other projects. It is an investment. If you do it right and do it well, So it's very daunting. A lot of people don't do it. And this is one of the major things, is when the things do shift, and they usually do, you have to send IRB the information. And IRB isn't, and no offense, because I know you used to, you've worked with IRB, isn't always, actually, I say ours is really good. When I was at Emory, they were terrible. They didn't really understand qualitative methods that well. And so it was all very biomed and quantitative, and so they were like, you're going to interview? Well, that's super sensitive. I'm like, well, it's not that bad, but this was a big deal, so they would take extra time. So UD has been great, and so is Christiana, actually. So is Thomas Jefferson.
Well, and I'll just throw it out there. One experience that I was surprised about in terms of like IRB issues with qualitative stuff, they're actually more open to letting you interview physicians than they are to staff. With the idea that often that their staff are a bit over-surveyed internally, and that if it's sort of IRB approved and it comes via, like, this is a Christiana thing, do staff have some expectation possibly that this is my work time, as opposed to they feel like, honestly, they're like, well, physicians are used to being asked to do a lot of things and they know it's, on their time. So anyway, just, I was surprised by that. They were like, oh yeah, physicians, that's fine. But if you want to interview other staff, then we have
Is
to
that your
talk to
perception
HR.
that you do when you actually are around the table and you get projects? Is that your perception for how it is, or is it here at Christiana?
That was Christiana. Christiana's IRB, and
yeah.
It was just kind of different. Yeah, I haven't seen as much qualitative stuff at U of D, and frankly, if it's physicians, chances are it would have come here. You know what I mean? They would have said to take it to Christiana.
Yeah. You bring up another good point in terms of thinking about your sample and the timetable of which you're going to be interviewing, how many you're going to be interviewing, how long it's going to take. Understand that that's going to take time as well in terms of building that timetable. I always say early interviews are sometimes even better than pre-tests because they let you know if your questions are actually working with your sample, what questions you may need to shift. If you need to kind of exclude a question, maybe bring a question in later into the game, or not even talk about it, right? So I always say these, in terms of interviews, use early interviews to the best of your advantage. And you should know, you just get a feel for it, as you move on in terms of your sample, all right? As you hit kind of data saturation, right? You'll start to feel the interviews be a little tedious. They're giving you similar answers. Nothing's really changing. You're getting to the end, and when you start to feel that, you're hitting that data saturation, right? You're also getting a little exhausted from interviewing, so keep that in mind. But understand when you start to smell data saturation, because that's a good sign that you're actually hitting some themes. All right, it might be time to wrap it up soon.
Everybody know what he means by saturation?
It means you're getting to the end, basically, right? The data.
You're getting repeats.
Yeah, the data is you're getting no new data, right? So you want to hit, if you have a samples at 20, right? You want to hit all those 20, but you may see around 15, maybe a number 14, you're getting the same kind of stuff. And you're like, okay, let's see. Maybe this is going to be it. So watch yourself as an interviewer in terms of your level of exhaustion when you get to that point, because you might just be breezing through your interviews, and you might miss something. So just take some time. Again, it's another time thing. Take some time from interviews. Don't try to get them all done at once. Right? Take your time. Build that timetable. Watch your relationships. Watch yourself. Know the type. Know your own stature, your status levels. Right? Your age, your race, your gender, SES. How that can impact your interactions with your sample, with your participants, right? That's a big issue. And you need to understand that you need to acknowledge that before going into the field. That could have an impact. During one of my interviews in my dissertation, I had a student cry in the middle. It was not even a sensitive question, just a sensitive time, just a hard time. And there's been other times where people have just broken down and talking about family histories or stories. What do? You're not a therapist, right? Maybe some of you are, actually. But I'm not. And so the question is, think about that. If you're talking about sensitive issues, you may get sensitive. You may hit a nerve. You have to be ready to how you're going to address that. How are you going to kind of make the interviewee feel comfortable, feel welcome, feel open, be able to talk to you about these issues, right? And then, because if you don't do it well, you don't respond well, they may go back and tell other people, hey, this isn't work. This isn't a fun thing. Right, so be very understanding about how you're presenting yourself. I engage in the art of self-deprecation when I do interviews, whether it's physicians or even med students or even undergrad students at UD. I self-deprecate during the interviews to allow them to feel empowered during the interview process, allow them to feel like they're the ones in control of the interview, even though I know I am. Right? But allow them, because then when they feel a little bit more in control, more comfortable, they will tell you more things.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Well, with physicians, no offense, Heather, or anybody else, it's pretty easy, right? There's a.
So how about somebody in the community?
Big piles of ego all over the table.
I didn't say that. I didn't say that. But with physicians,
We bow to you.
Yeah. But no, it's a little bit easier. Like I'm not dressed 100% professional today, but like there's a reason for that in terms of how I want them to feel in the room. I want them to feel as though they have the power to talk about things. So with undergraduates, they may know I'm a professor, but if I'm emailing them, well, first of all, usually I'll have a student researcher email them, not me, about the study, or I'll have a graduate student do that. And sometimes even during the interview process, I won't go. I'll have someone I know I've trained very well to do interviews, so that it's not me, Professor Michalek, doing the interviews. All right, and sometimes I aim for race concordance, I aim for gender concordance. I try to aim for these things to allow people to feel more comfortable with the interviewer. I know some undergrads may not like, especially if they've had me for a class and I feel a good rapport, then I'll go ahead and do it. But if they haven't, I don't want to put that professor-student, because then they may feel like, hey, this could really be an impact in terms of my grades or how they understand things. So know your role with that audience as well. Does that help answer? Certain other
I'm
group.
wondering, do you do interviews? Do you do work in the community? Do you go to places where you're not the same as everybody else? And how would you be self-deprecating in a situation like that?
So a situation like that, I think about my dress, my style. Like I said, again, I think about style of dress. When I'm dealing with patients, right, especially with focus groups, if it's here, I try to dress down to some extent if I'm going to ask questions, right, to make it seem as though I'm not one of them. I immediately say I'm from the sociology department, right, and the questions I ask, I don't ask more formally. I might try to use more contemporary examples, less kind of academic or scholastic. So it's not to dumb it down.
Yeah.
It's not dumbing it down. It's the idea of relating to your audience, right? Understand. Now, when I interview, like I say, with physicians, I will dress up, but I will act as though I am not. You are smarter. You know what you're talking about. That kind of thing. Which, if they're talking about something, they are smarter than you. If you want data from them, your interviewee knows more than you.
Always,
Yeah.
whether they're a doctor or not.
Exactly. So understand that's the data you want to get, right? Oh yeah, whoops, I want to go back here. Sit and listen. A lot of people have a hard time with that. Where did I go here? There we go. Sit and listen. Understand your posture has a big impact in terms of how you're working with people. Understand how you're looking, how you're talking to people, the way you're asking questions. All these things, when I say, oh yeah, no duh, like, of course I understand that. Watch yourself, or watch someone else do an interview, right? It really impacts how you're getting the data. You are a filter. Your body is a filter. You as a person are a filter. Whatever you are doing, the data is coming through you, right? So understand that and be aware of how you're dressed, what you're saying, how you're saying it, your nonverbal cues, right?
It's actually really interesting. It reminds me a lot of what I do in palliative medicine.
Yeah.
People are like, oh, how did you talk to the family about that? How did you get so much information? I'm like, I didn't talk.
Exactly.
I found the right spot to really listen and just be in a space and maybe offer some empathy. But it's really them talking to you. I think we all have we all want to chime in too quickly. And sometimes that pause will let somebody get to the next space of what they're going to say, and they may not circle back around to it if you cut into that space.
It's totally true. Yeah, watch your agenda in terms of your research, your interview questions. Sometimes just waiting allows for, like, the silence people will like, oh God, silence, no. They'll just talk. Even if maybe they want to say some more, or maybe they don't, but they have more to say. And that silence allows them the opportunity. And one thing you brought up is very important, and we'll talk about this when we go over kind of coding, but pauses and ums are very important. Because people may be, they're thinking about something, but they may be kind of shifting gears in terms of thought. So acknowledge those pauses and ums when we'll go over kind of coding. Sure, yeah.
You may address this later on.
Yeah.
How to accurately document what the person is actually saying and not what you're internalizing. You take copious notes. You have a tape recorder, or do you videotape, or is that something?
We're gonna go over that a little bit, but it's we can talk about it now, and we'll just kind of skip it over a little bit then. It depends, of course, on your preference and the participant's preference. So they may not want to be audio recorded. So you always have to ask for permission for that. I always use an auto recorder when allowed because then I can just get it transcribed and I don't have to worry about it. My notes have to do more with the environment, how they're responding. If they have said something at a particular time, I look at the recorder to see what time it was and note that was very important. I got to note that down. Or say, hey, this is starting to come out, or they're acting like this when they're talking about this. This seems to be something. So it's my memos are more for me in terms of remember this. This is happening. This is going on, and the recorder is picking up the data. So it's kind of working with another researcher. If you don't get a recorder, you got to watch it. You got to watch it because what ends up happening is when you're taking notes, the participant shuts up. Immediately, the moment pen goes to paper, you lose eye contact. They're done. It tends to happen. Not all, but most. So you got to be very, very careful. Now you might have a team member that can take notes while and that's good. But maintaining eye contact, maintaining kind of that level of empathy in terms of personal connection and comfort is very important. And now those kind of tools can help or hinder. Videotapes are very difficult to get IRB approval of, but when you use them, they're wonderful, right? Because then you can see the interaction. See what's going on. Like almost like a standardized patient type of exercise. Talking about yourself, that is up to you. Depends on your level of intimacy and connection with the patient population or the sample or participants. Right? I have a couple graduate scholars who are very good at integrating things about themselves into the interview, therefore creating a relationship with the interviewee. It's wonderful. Now, coding it is a pain in the butt because then I've got all this stuff I don't need. But it creates an environment, and that's the key for an interview to kind of flourish. So that's all about your personal preference, right? And all about what you think may be needed in that area. And then the sit and listen, I said, part of it, like I said, you can train, you can help, you can listen, you can learn, but part of it's difficult to be trained. Some people are going to be better listeners than others. Focus groups, some of you are probably doing focus groups, right? That's usually the number one way. It's a series of small group of people, 6 to 10, led by a trained moderator. That's the key. All right. If you've been trained in terms of qualitative methods and how to lead a group in other ways, that's great. The keys to focus groups is not too small, because if you get too small, you get 2 people talking. I've been in these groups that are miserable, and you're basically done in a minute. Or not too large, because then a couple people may dominate and you're done. Right? Accepting environment. Always think about where you're hosting those focus groups. Where are they going to be? Is that an environment where the participants want to be in, where they feel comfortable?
I've had a situation, and it's for publication purposes, when I only could interview 2 people, and it was much more productive in a group as opposed to individually. I always call it focus groups, and I always question myself, will the reviewers say this is not really a focus group? Is there any other terminology for that? Because you don't have the luxury of, I'm going to invite other people because only 2 people really can comment on it.
I mean, that seems to be, it is a group.
This is a group, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I guess,
It's almost like a dyad interview.
Yeah, or a dual interview.
Relationship, like parent-child?
No, this is not. This is 2 instructors discussing the issues that are their observations. So it can be their journals that they're discussing, their notes, observations, field notes. Consequently.
That's a great question. I've never heard of a specific type of method of just 2 people. I guess you would say interviews with 2 people, or very intimate focus group with 2 people.
Yeah, I just know, when you write, this is the methodology I used.
I would go, my advice would be to say, focus group or interview, whichever you feel more comfortable with, then footnote it and find another study that's done the same thing, use the same language. Okay. And then just say so-and-so used the same term to describe this. Boom. Yes.
Some of your go-to methods for when you have a group and you have a dominant voice.
Yes. Oh, yeah. That's very tough. Again,
it's a good life skill too.
It is.
Someone has to go to a lot of meetings.
It's kind of how do you sway, right? How do you acknowledge and sway? And so I always liken to that Friends episode, which is like hug for her, roll for you. So it's a question of, how do you make someone feel acknowledged? Because clearly they want to be heard. And then how do you let everyone else be heard? So what I try to do personally is someone's talking a lot, someone's engaged a lot. I say, this is an excellent point. And then I say, okay, so you're saying this. Anyone else? anyone else, and then kind of, so I'm not shutting them out, but I make sure I make eye contact with everyone else, and then if he or she picks back up, then I acknowledge a little bit and say, okay, that's great, really good points. If there's anyone else around here, I'd love to hear from you, that kind of thing. So I'm not unacknowledging or lack of acknowledgement, but I'm trying to bring in other people. Usually it's the same person with every question, and you just got to be careful. You just got to kind of engage them and let it go. Hopefully, with your groups, you've got to be careful about not just dominant voices, but other people in the group where others could feel sensitive about talking. So one of the projects we did here about the transfer from the MICU to the ER, right? So we were having nurses come in and give focus groups about their experiences with a particular program. Well, I wanted to make sure that we didn't have ER and MICU nurses in at the same time so that they could describe their own experiences independently. And I also wanted them there, the nurses specifically, and not other healthcare professionals, so I got the nursing perspective, right? And not saying that they wouldn't feel comfortable talking with others in the room, but I wanted to make sure that I knew I was getting that information. It wasn't going to be influenced by other voices, because I've been in things where I've had, attendings and residents and some med students, and it's gone to hell. Immediately you can see the status divisions, and it's like, oh crap, like I know I shut somebody up. So you just got to be careful in terms of who you're inviting to the groups at each time, who's leading the group, and what questions are being asked. Again, think of it as a very sensitive time. Does that help? Any other questions about focus groups? I'm going to do a couple other things, but yeah.
The average length of time?
Depends, of course. I mean, I usually let the participants dictate that. When I get towards the end of my questions and I feel that nothing really big is coming up, I end with, are there any other points that anyone would like to make? And usually, if there's not, or if there's something else I want to bring up, if someone mentioned such and such, like I'll look through my notes, let's talk more about that. When I feel as though you'll just, you kind of feel it, it's like the end of it, that they have nothing left to say, you have no more points to cover. I think we keep to 45 minutes to an hour to respect the participants' time. So that's kind of the general gist. But of course, if you have a group there that's, you want to set a 2-hour limit and they're willing to come, you've got 2 hours. But yeah, 45, and also think about in terms of transcription. That's gonna be expensive, and you may not even get that much data towards the end. So. Disadvantages to group dynamics, like I was talking about, time planning. Getting everyone together at one time can be very difficult, as we found a number of times, right? So trying to make that happen, again, can take time, can take money. Do you bring lunch? Do you create an environment in which people feel free to get up and go to the bathroom or that kind of stuff? Think about all these things as you're designing or planning your research. Participant observation. So this is one of my favorite. Anyone doing participant observation? Tough to do.
We'll be doing observation with field notes and. Yes.
Love participant observation. Like, you use focus groups, fantastic, but participant observation, you really get a feel. I mean, you change the environment the moment you put yourself in, right? Everything else. But participant observations, you can really get a feel if you do enough of them over time, right? You'll get a feel for what actually happens in this environment. You can actually see culture, right, at play. And that can be very interesting. So researcher observes individuals or groups of individuals in their natural setting. You can be very involved, or you can let people, not even let people know that you're a researcher, or you can let people know you're a researcher, right? So there's a kind of a continuum of participant observation in terms of how much you want to be a participant and how much you want to be an observer. That has a lot to do with your own research interest, but also with IRB's approval. Right? So I'm assuming most people are doing, I'm a researcher, I'm going to be observing you. Here's what I'm coming.
So for that, are you generally doing vocal continuous observations of the people? I mean,
yeah, you want to watch out though, because if you want to get a gist or an understanding of what happens in this particular time frame or this particular phenomena or social setting, you're going to want to, how many times do you go and when do you go? So do you go in the morning? So an example, if I want to see interactions in a coffee shop, right? I would probably have to go to that coffee shop at many different hours in the day, and so I understood who goes when, what groups go when, and then who works when, and how that all impacts, what goes on there. So those types of things, timing out when you go, how many different times, and then how many times you go each time. So do you go 10 times at this particular time frame? 10 times at each, so you got to map all of that out to get an actual understanding. Because if you just go one time all the time, that's all you know. And I mean, the true thing.
The problem I have with observations by one single person is that it can be very subjective, right? Yeah. Based on your experiences. If somebody doesn't have as much experience, that they don't understand the connections, or it is just simply subjective. You look at the people differently than somebody else. Yeah. For publication purposes, I always struggle to report anything that is provided by just one person. I always look at how can we increase credibility. So what are some of the techniques? Are you going to talk about that later?
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about it now. It's fine. So if you have a team member, right, and you want to get that inter-rater reliability, right? That's the catchphrase. Inter-rater reliability, and we'll talk about that too when we talk over coding, inter-coder reliability. But inter-rater reliability or inter-observer reliability, making sure you have 2 people, maybe even 3, in a setting that are seeing the same things. So a technique to do that is similar to how you would do it if you were doing coding. You each do, now you may do it differently, and you can do it differently. How I set it up is we each do the same setting, maybe on a different day, but like let's do the coffee shop example. 8 o'clock from 8 to 10 at this same coffee shop, everyone goes on a Monday, right? And so those 3 Mondays, then we compare notes. Then we do a Wednesday, we compare notes. Then we do a Friday, we compare notes, or a Thursday, right? If we're all getting the same things, then I feel as though we can do it independently at different times.
That's sufficient for reviewers.
Yes.
Have you found that sufficient?
Yeah, I have. In terms of intercoder reliability, if you can show that in a series of pretests there was a high rate of inter-rater reliability. Now, with qualitative methods, it's difficult because this gets into an issue I have in general. So it depends on how you're coding it, because then if it comes down to coding, is it a frequency analysis? And is that what you're using, or are we getting the same themes? Are we seeing the same things? So that depends on your reviewers.
Do you work off an ethogram, or do you just sort of everybody thinks their own?
Ah, exactly. I love it. This is a great question. So, okay. So we're getting into a bigger issue, which is fine. You need to think about what would be the best way from the beginning. Now, the most fundamental way, kind of from the bottom floor, would be that all of you go to the same setting, like 3 of you, at the same time, right, for a couple different instances. Compare notes, all of us saw the same things, great, awesome. And you write that up as a pretest. These are a series of pretests. We all went to the same event at the same time. This is what happened.
How do you report it? A percentage of agreement?
See, now, that's so now reviewers, and this is where I have an issue in terms of different types of journals look for different types of things. And now reviewers, even within different types of journals, look for different things. In some of the journals that we published our work in, they've required a frequency analysis of particular themes, which to me is like, just shoot me, just stab me right in the heart.
If you're a qualitative researcher,
that's the antithesis of what I do, right? So I'm like, you want me to quantify
quality.
So, yeah. But I do it because I want publications. But you try to get your own little feel in there too. So that's one way of doing it to get it through, and you'll know the truth, I guess you could say. Another way of doing it is that when you're coding, you all have the same themes, and maybe there's different types of conceptualization of that theme, but it's all on the same kind of level. And if you can argue that, and this is the hardest part, and this is why when I come in January, this is where it gets really tricky, and we have one specific class, 4 grad students for a whole semester on this. Getting those codes to actually, they look similar, and what people mean by them. That can be very difficult to describe. You might need paragraphs and paragraphs to describe what it means to interact. Like, or, it doesn't mean like how many times they actually were face to face, or how many, that kind of stuff. It gets very tricky. So I love how you threw like the box of snakes at me right in the beginning, right? How do you get it so reviewers are okay with it? So honestly, the safest bet is getting like, let's say 3 people if you have a team, or 2 people, same event, different times, and then doing a frequency. We saw this. Ugh.
To push back a little bit, as somebody who's more like a quantitative person that then came to it, I think if you're on the outside looking in at this paper that someone's writing, and you were to tell me, well, a theme emerged that, money really matters.
Yes. Yeah.
okay, that sounds fine, but what I don't know is, if you were one person that talked to one person, then, that might be a bunch of baloney. If you can tell me that you, along with two other co-investigators, interviewed 30 people, and 28 out of the 30 people, when asked that question, made some reference to money.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Then
But then I would say that the reference matters, but in what context and to what depth did they describe it? And you can only get that by actually talking about it.
Right.
So,
I think
I see your point, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think.
And this is part of why we use mixed methods.
Yeah. Sometimes you show the what with the quantitative, and the how and the why with the qualitative. That's how I describe it to my students.
You have a focus group, right? And only one person mentions it, and it's not something that you can quantify in frequency. But that person is a representative of the population, so I especially if I find it important and innovative and something that I haven't heard of, I still report it in the publication because it is finally getting to
Other
the truth,
interesting
right?
findings.
An interesting finding. Do I have to go to another 50 people to find that this is
next study.
Well, I think it raises a question, right? If you have 20 people and 19 say sort of, the most important thing is, red, and then this one person goes on and on and on about green, it's, you can't say, look, green really matters, but you can say that for some reason, you know what I mean? There's a question there. Why does everybody but this person think red?
And
right?
it's totally, you're totally true. You got to keep it out there, and you got to keep it in the back of your mind and say, okay, wait, there's something going on here. Let's explore this, and maybe you introduce it into questions that you might have your next focus groups or interviews or things like that to see maybe there is something there that this person sees that other people see too, but just haven't asked the question in the right way. That can be tricky. But kind of getting back to your point, it has a lot to do with, how you're coding it, and I always tell my students, you write up your analysis to give you the right to discuss your findings. So how you write up your analysis, how you coded your data, gives you the right to provide the audience with how you think how you interpreted those findings. So writing up analysis becomes the key element of any qualitative paper. All right, it's not just the findings are important, but writing up that analysis, how you coded that data, becomes the crux, because it is your argument. It gives you the right. So we'll talk about that next time. But thanks for that. Thanks for that terrible question. No, that was a good question. So talking about pursuing observations, I always bring up the stuff I did, my dissertation. This is Emory's med school in 2008. It was a new, this was like just this, and they added that in 2008. So I did observations of all classes for first and second year med students, labs, small groups. I couldn't do it all classes. Sometimes the first and second year classes met at the same time. But over the course of the year, all classes, labs, including anatomy labs, small groups, and then just interactions in hallways. So when you talk about observations and wanting to get a better understanding of what goes on, I put myself in every possible nook and cranny that I could find them, even intramurals, anything on campus that I could engage them with, I was there, right, to get a better understanding. So here's one of their classes. I don't know, I always say, I show this picture, and I never, these people were just there when I took it. I don't know who they are. Anyway, so I put myself up right back there during all classes and labs. I'm sorry, all classes that were in this. And all first, this is what I looked like when I was in. I had no beard, like the real beard, and shaved head. But so I could see. So here's in here would be the kind of podium where the lecturer would stand and talk. But the cool thing about this was not only could I see, who was falling asleep, I could see all the students, but also all their computers were facing me. So I could see if they were kind of, I had a measure of paying attention, because I wanted to know when instructors talked about other, patients and other orientation, empathy, compassion, where were the students? Were they listening? And I could have a view, if they were on ESPN or Facebook or something like that, I could see that and have a kind of a rudimentary measure of paying attention, right? I could see if they were falling asleep or what was going on. And of course I was, in there counting hours and things like that. But that's where I stood to get a good view, right? You want a bird's eye view of the whole thing. Small group rooms in this particular building, I would sit in a chair in the corner usually. These were OSCE suites. So they would do stimulated patients in there, have small group exercises. So again, picking a spot where you are known, you can be seen, people knew where I was, but I was out of the way. So after a while, after about a few weeks, people just ignored me. Here's their anatomy lab. So these were all tables. It was a new anatomy lab, and I would put myself back there. I had to wear a white coat when I went in there. That was part of the rules. But let me just show you this. Back here where the skeleton is, you can see the hooks for the students' white coats. So all the kind of other students who weren't in the lab at the time, all the coats were there. And you can, those of you who have engaged in anatomy lab understand that it stinks in there. So I would be back there with my white coat observing students in this like hall of stink back there, trying to understand, what they were doing in anatomy lab. So you put yourselves in these positions to observe what's going on and understand that that's going to impact the data you get. Okay, so using your surroundings, I always say use what you know. It's better to put yourself into if you're doing observations, into an area that you feel comfortable with. And if you don't feel comfortable with it, get in there before you start doing the study, because you best feel comfortable with it, or else you're going to have 1,000 points of data that you're not going to know. And you're not going to know what they actually mean to the people. One of the issues I ran into, and this was for observations, a project here, was that I didn't know of particular different types of ways of speaking and culture between two departments here at Christiana. And I, like a dummy, and I went in there thinking that this won't be a big deal. I'll know exactly what's going on. I got in there, it was two different worlds trying to conversate with each other, and I say know before you dig. Before you go in there and start digging through data, understand your situation, understand your environment, understand what you're going into. Know the people that are involved in this game before you go in, or else you might have a misleading data because you don't know what you're looking at. So doing pre-tests or doing pre-interviews or sitting in an environment with just taking notes for a week or so, always a good idea. Okay? Again, time consuming, money consuming, but worth it. Getting along, what are some examples of difficult settings? Anybody here have a difficult setting they're going to be observing or conducting interviews in?
What setting?
Like a difficult setting.
Difficult setting.
Like a sensitive setting?
Yeah, like ours is going to be with chronically ill patients.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sitting here thinking about, not just the demographics of the patients, but then what other, who else was in the home. So I go back to what Eva was asking. So now, where we're looking to use a format of a question or survey, does it potentially become a focus group, because you may now have 3 or 4 other family members answering what you're trying to capture?
Yeah, that might just be interviews with families. So you're interviewing the patient, but then you're definitely going to want to talk to the family, because their perspective of what's happening, isn't it's an intersubjective experience. So you're going to need to know that kind of stuff. So it's an interview with a family, or focus groups with families, depending upon how you want to phrase it. But that'll be really rich data. And then if you're going to the homes, is that where you're going to be doing the interviews?
So
I mean, then
going into the homes versus telephonic in terms of actual process.
So that's an issue right there. Telephone can be a big issue. It can be a hindrance in terms of a barrier, because you can't get facial expressions, you can't get body language, and usually what I found with telephone interviews is people stop short. They don't really go into a great deal of time. So it's good to get you don't get deep data, but you get good surface level data so to answer initial questions. But if you really want to get in there, home, or bring them here if they're here, making sure they're not going out of the way. But the home would be great, because then you could observe the home setting.
A practical concern of that actually is these patients' owners are often elderly, so I actually worry about hearing impairment,
That's true.
Cognitive impairment.
That's totally true. Yeah, these are all things you have to think about with your patient population. You may need to limit your sample size to 10, 15, and just do interviews at home. That kind of thing would make it, the data would be rich, and you keep it small because you'd have to. But something to think about. And also watch IRB in terms of getting in the homes, because that can be difficult. But that's where the data would be, because then you could observe the home setting too. Could I say it like it's my project? I don't have to do it. Don't do that. Yeah, my advisor was in grad school. I did my dissertation. He's like, you should actually enroll in medical school and be a student, not tell anyone. I'm like, you are crazy. Like, I got to get out of this graduate program. Let me just get my project done.
Did he offer to pay the
bill? No, exactly. But there was an agreement between the dean of the medical school and my department that if that was the case, it would have been fine.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and the tests, we would have found a way where I didn't have to take the tests, but I would have been a considered student. It was in writing. And I was like, absolutely not. That's too much time. Like, it already became too much time. I call it a pseudo-ethnography. We'll go over ethnography in a second. Because I was there all the time, but they didn't know I was a researcher. So in that sense, they wouldn't have, it would have been a pure ethnography.
Oh, wow.
I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't mature enough as a researcher to do that, I don't think. Understand,
Undercover,
you
yeah.
really do. You have to let go of your entire self, and we'll go over that in 1 second when we talk about ethnography, how dangerous that can be. Understand the emotional and physical challenges of doing participant observation. Even interviews can get very physically draining if you're sitting there talking to someone, and emotionally draining. I talk about this with empathy, with physicians and med students, right? Hearing someone else's sensitive stories and things like that, emotionally laden stories, can be very harmful. And you have to watch yourself as a researcher. I know it sounds like, oh, I'm going to have a hard exterior. You'll feel it. And then you got to watch how that impacts how you've interpreted the data. So you have to be mindful of the data you're getting and what people are saying. Watch out for info overload. So much information going on, especially with participant observations. How much distance you create. And then acceptable incompetence and selective competence. This question of when you see things, is it okay that you solve them? You have to, if you're doing participant observation and something happens in a particular setting that may not be on the up and up, or may not even be lawful, how much did you see, and how do you know how to report that, and should you report that, and who should report it to? These are things, if you're dealing with sensitive samples, that you may have to be aware. People who do studies on elder abuse, sometimes, they go in the field and they actually see that abuse while in the field. How do they engage in that? These types of, how do they understand that? They saw that was exactly the data they were looking for. And then how do they deal with that? That's something you need to think about before you go into the field. And that gets into the idea of how do you get out of the field? Now, a lot of people don't think about this. They interject themselves into these people's lives. And they say, here, I'm here for you. I'm listening to all your stories, almost serving as a therapist to some extent, or as a way to vent. And you got all your data, and you're like, all right, see ya. I'm gone. You got to think about how you're going to let it go. That was a bad thing that I didn't do with the med student population. I got very close to them because I was there for a year, 2 years. And then I just left. I was like, I got a job. I'll see you guys later. I didn't say anything, and now, I feel terrible. I really do. I feel really badly. Some students were actually kind of upset. They're like, you just left. You got what you needed and left. It really made me think about the kind of impression that you leave and how you've actually kind of formed connections and relationship with this population, this sample. So be careful about that. Be mindful. Participatory action research. Anyone engaging in participatory action research? Where you're engaging community members as researchers? Okay, well, that's okay. Honestly, it's not always talked about. So if it's not written in a I've seen grant applications where people are actually doing PAR. They don't know they're doing it. They're doing interviews and observations, and they're saying, oh, and we're going to engage community members in terms of forming our questions, coding our data, that kind of stuff, and actually doing interviews, and it's PAR. And it's actually a very worthwhile method that gets a lot of grant money. It's very welcome. So think about it. And actually, there's some cases now, I think in the UK, where certain types of research, they have to have patients on the actual research team in order to do the type of stuff. So PAR seeks to understand and improve the world by changing it. At its heart, it's collective, self-reflective inquiry that researchers and participants, I've bolded that, undertake so they can understand and improve upon the practices in which they participate and the situations in which they find themselves. The reflective process is directly linked to action, influenced by understanding the history, culture, and local context embedded in social relationships. Sometimes as a researcher, you will never understand the social context of what you are studying because you are not a part of it. You are outside of it. That's what PAR really helps out, because you're engaging the community as researchers. They know the culture. They know the history of that area. They know the context of what you're studying. Right? So you engage them in terms of formulating questions. Engage them in terms of getting other people. It's not just snowballing. It's getting them to bring in people, getting them to ask questions to people. Right? Not just using them as informants or gatekeepers, but using them as a research team member. It's hard to do because some people who don't have the training, it's going to be difficult, but it's a very excellent and engaging way of doing this. It takes some time, it takes patience, and it takes some actual know-how, but it's fantastic. Advocates that those being researched should be involved in the process actively. So I talked earlier about that kind of status differential and the power between the researcher and the participant. PAR tries to really minimize that power status differential. Yeah.
Isn't the ACE award really for that? That's what I was thinking. Yeah, right. We're all doing
But
that.
that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
But one of the things, yeah, it's totally true. And I think one of the good things about the ACE program, especially, is that it starts that process of learning how to do that. Because that's not something you can just jump into, right?
Yeah.
So ACE allows you to engage in, from how I understand, engage in those processes so that you can kind of cultivate that research kind of team. So you're exposing other individuals to these methods and things, and then you're saying, okay, now it's kind of like they do in med school, right? See one, do one, teach one, right? And so that's how you're engaging the research community members.
We have our community partners who are at a different level of understanding what research is about and what it involves and how to analyze data.
Yep.
And I think in these sessions, they're getting trained
Yes.
in doing so,
Yes.
and they will be the ones from the community coming in to help us analyze the data. So I think a lot of us are doing that.
And then, and I think the next
all of
steps,
us.
yeah, exactly. The steps then are to formulate the next research project.
Yep.
From their, their perspective.
Using their perspective.
Exactly.
Yep.
And then the what you would quote unquote, and I'm not using this term in a derogatory word, but the scholars then take a second tier. Community member researchers take the PI roles, and then on the next kind of project, that kind of thing. That's how I see ACE really working out, and hoping that that's how it works out, and hoping that the community engagement aspect of our CTR actually works in that way as well, hopefully. All right. You're all doing it. You're trying. Pros, lived experience, interpretation minimizes the power of the researcher, like I said. Getting in, organizing, that can be very difficult. Willingness of community members. The idea of too many cooks in the kitchen, a big issue in terms of any team-based research, right? Always a big problem. I love doing solo-based research because it's just me, right? At the same time, it's only one person interpreting the data, only one person doing the methods. When you have a lot of people, oh, I think it smells like this. No, it doesn't. Yeah, but it's going to work that way, right? Okay, ethnography, my true favorite of things, but very difficult to do. If you ever had the time. So yeah, the zebra, guys dressed in zebra getting attacked by lions, right? It can involve multiple methods. It's like extreme participant observation, right? You are a pure participant. You are observing as well, but you are participating in this kind of social phenomena. It's easier for social commentators, people who are not kind of trained researchers who don't need IRB really to do their program, like reporters and things like that, because they don't need to disclose. They can really just go in. Ethnography, you have to think about your level of disclosure. You can still disclose that you're a researcher and do your ethnography. It's going to be harder to blend in the beginning. Pseudo-ethnography, like I said, that's what my med school stuff was. I didn't live with the med students or do everything they did, but I did a majority of it. Bias. In terms of ethnography, you kind of brought up this issue before in terms of having one person's perspective. Usually you don't have ethnography with more than one person, usually it's just one person. So you got to watch your values at the door. Also, watch it when you get into the actual phenomena, into the actual social world, and that what you're doing, have you not lost your kind of clothes as a scholar? Have you kind of gone native, as they say, right? Too much data, you can get way too much data, and you kind of screwed yourself out of any publication, or getting done anytime soon, and also getting too close to subjects. That can easily happen. There's a lot of papers about that. Also, there's been a number of studies that have pointed to the mental and physical dangers of doing true ethnographies, because you can actually lose yourself to some extent, lose your identity, because that's kind of what you're supposed to be doing in an ethnography. Right? You're engaging so much, you almost lose who you are to be a part of this and get the data you want. It could have ramifications. It's a beautiful way of studying. It takes tons of time to do it right. You find a lot of tenured faculty doing it, or graduate students. You don't see a lot of just, early like assistant professors thinking, I'm going to do an ethnography. You just read yourself out of tenure there. All right. Why do qualitative methods? When would it be a good time to use participant observations or focus groups over a survey? What do you guys think? Wouldn't be good. Why not use a survey? Some of you are doing interviews or focus groups. Why not do a survey? Why can't I just do a survey?
I find a survey to be the most structured way to ask questions or to get just the data that I need. Like I said, when I have theoretical framework and I was collecting, I had to collect it from 100 of students. I mean, imagine interviews with 100 students. I don't think there's a way you can do that. That gives you more breadth of information. You know that's the representative. I think that's when the come in, when the sample is too big. or before you actually surveys you can do before you to structure your questions for your focus for focus interviews, right? So that's I think when surveys are important.
Yeah, I completely agree. Any other else?
It's less labor intensive.
It's much less labor.
because
It can be. Yeah, it can be depending on data and analysis, but yeah, it can be a lot less data time intensive and effort intensive.
When you don't know what questions are asked on the survey.
When you want to know what, right? When you want to know the what, surveys are really good with the what. The what actually is happening. You can use attitude, perceptions, any type of scales to get at a general understanding of what you're trying to study and then say, okay, why? Why is this? And then you can use interviews. And that's a good point. Anything else? Yeah, when you're trying to figure out the landscape of things, when surface level stuff, it's a great time for surveys. But then when you want to get a little deeper, focus groups, observations, interviews. How are these methods? Always think about this when you're writing up your proposals. And because I write this on grant reviews all the time, you never convince me that this type of method is the best way to address your research questions, or these methods are the best ways to address your research questions. Making sure in your proposals or in your write-ups, in your reports and in your papers, your publication papers, why were these methods the key methods to use? Why were they important? How do they help answer your question? I always tell my students, why couldn't you just done surveys? Would have gotten the same kind of things, right? So you got to know that. Necessary to swim. See, I know these slides so well, right? And then always show your work. When you're interviewing, when you're observing, jot down where you are, what you're wearing, what you're thinking about, what you're feeling, all of these things, every little bit of information. Always show your work, because you won't want to go back and be like, what was that date? Who did I talk to then? Why was this important? Right? You never want to have to go back because you can't. So always show your work. And also when you write up your analysis, that's when that comes in a big deal, right? So when you're writing up your analysis section, you need to know the specifics of what you did, when you did them, who you did them with. So always show your work. Any questions for this particular time? Yeah, about 15 minutes, I got a couple of seconds. About your specific proposals, kind of the methods that we've gone over. Any questions about how you're going to use interviews or observations or focus groups with your specific proposals?
I'm being very obtuse.
That's right.
Could you just explain ethnography a little bit more?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Just
No problem. No, it's fine. So think about it this way. I'll give an example. So the book I was talking about before, Down on Their Luck, there was two scholars from University UT Austin that wanted to study homelessness population in Austin, Texas. So what they did was one of them integrated themselves into the homeless population. The other was up in an apartment using the notes that the other was taking and coding them and that kind of stuff. So that one that was down in there was engaged in an ethnography, because even though they did let them all know they were a researcher, they embedded themselves in the field. Now, it depends on how deep you want to go with the term ethnography. Was it pure? Because they didn't always sleep there. And they did it for about a year. They were there every day, and they went into the homeless shelters. They went into everything other homeless people went into. But they didn't always sleep there. They weren't there every day, and they didn't necessarily have the same struggles. So I would classify it as a pseudo-ethnography because it wasn't completely engaged in that group. I'm trying to think of other really, really good. It's hard to find because IRB has really strapped the researcher in that way for a good reason. Because in terms of the participants and the researcher, but embedding yourself into the actual population completely. Yeah, as best you can. Yeah. For over a period of time. So getting in the right headspace in terms of getting into the field, and I'm going to do this briefly because there's only a little bit of time. Think of qualitative researchers in this way. I think of it as a quilter, a bricolaire, a jazz artist, someone who can bring together a lot of different elements of the world, right? So the construction, creation of work from diverse range of things. The quilter stitches, edits, and puts slices of reality together. This process creates and brings psychological and emotional unity, a pattern, an interpretive experience, right? So that's your job as a qualitative researcher, is to bring all of this stuff together to figure out what is actually happening here. Right? You have all these different perspectives, including your own, right? What is actually going on? Different voices, different perspectives, different points of vision and angles. Nor does the qualitative research have a distinct set of methods or practices that are entirely its own. Qualitative researchers use semiotics, narrative, content disclosure, archival and phenomenology, hermeneutics, feminism, rhizomatics. I'm
not even asking.
Oh, yeah. I actually don't even know. I wrote it down. Deconstructionism, ethnography, interviewing, psychoanalysis, cultural studies, survey research, all of these things, right? There's no specific method that is just qualitative research, right? So there's a lot to it. You got to bring it all together. I look at qualitative researcher as what happens when a stranger approaches a social group in which they wish to deal with, right? So always using the stranger perspective. I say, go into an area that you know if you're doing observations, right? And you're going to have a background knowledge of your actual area of study, but go into it if you can as a stranger, right? Try to leave everything at the door. Go in there with new vision if you can. Drop those values out there. Qualitative data gathering can be like herding cats. Right, a lot of different things coming around, trying to bring it all together can be very difficult, can be very frustrating. And the idea of making the familiar strange, right? So putting a new set of glasses on to view the world around you. It's very difficult. Even when the scenario is familiar, the researcher must find ways of recovering that stranger position. That can be challenging. We don't have to go over this too much, but this is the way I think about things in terms of getting into the field. Right? Qualitative research kind of comes from a postmodern perspective, right? There is no there. There is no reality. It's all constructed. It's all constantly constructed. So you have to get it from the perspective of those in that culture that are constructing it. I always use in the Matrix, there's that little boy who says, there is no spoon, right? As the spoon starts to bend. If you want to see it, I put the link up there. That's how I think of qualitative research and engaging in the field. There is no there. Right? You have to figure that out from what they're saying. That's the there. You don't belong. Right? It's hard to kind of put yourself in that mindset. Even though you're going to be interpreting those words, you have that power. That is their world. That is your sample's world, not yours. Researchers are a part of the research setting, and that reality is socially constructed. So to some extent, you're actually helping construct that reality during that time. Qualitative research is an uphill battle. I'm using an example of terms of what a reviewer once told me. And actually, this is kind of thematic of what I get told by researchers. So I think qualitative research can be harder to write up and get accepted sometimes in certain types of journals. I said, certainly the health fields. I'm biased. Okay, this is an actual quote from a reviewer. A substantial reduction of the verbatim quotations as a standalone element in the paper. I wonder if this is our paper. Even when correctly reported and in context, a verbatim quotation tells only that one person said one thing on one occasion and forms no basis for rational policy making. However, if the substance comes from their quantitative data, then there are good reasons for them to illustrate and explain why those data mean, and to do so by using relevant quotations and context. So basically what the reviewer is saying, if you had some survey data that show what, and you had this as fodder for that argument, but as a standalone, not so much. This is an issue that you're going to run into, possibly, maybe not. There are specific journals out there for qualitative health research, but this is something that I run into all the time. How do I know that what you're saying, or how you've interpreted this data, is actually the proper way of interpreting? How do I know this means anything? Like the point you were saying. And that's how the analysis comes in. I use this with my students, right? So, what does this mean for your particular project? Always dot your I's, always show your work, right? And I think about it this way, right? So here's qualitative research, and here's biomedical clinical perspective. Doesn't always agree, right? They can't always agree. They're starting to agree more often, but doesn't always agree in terms of the type of way you present your research, especially in the health fields. The paradigms for constructing social research are always shifting. To us, research is more of a craft. Not a slavish adherence to methodological rules. No study conforms exactly to a standard methodologically. Each one calls for the researcher to bend the methodology to the uniqueness of the setting or case. Right, those are kind of standalone. Miles and Uberman and Saldana are key qualitative sociologists, qualitative researchers, I'll call them. That's their perspective. So it's a very organic feel to it. I'll kind of finish up with this, right, in terms of sampling. Who do you need? Why do you need them? And why are they valuable to your setting? When you're thinking about the sample that you're going to go for, why do you need them? How do you get to them? And why are they valuable? Always think about that. Where and how do you recruit them? And then all these answers should stem from your research questions. So when looking at your research questions, understand, okay, how do I then frame my sampling methods behind that for qualitative methods? I'm going to finish with that because it's going to leave you about 10 minutes for questions. Okay, even though there's a couple more slides, I'll go over those next time when I come back. But this is a good way. Plus also an hour and a half is a long time. To go over the wonders of qualitative methods. Any questions about, I mean, I can go a little bit more into sampling, but any questions related to your own research projects about specific types of qualitative methods? One of the things that I feel personally is that I could do this every day for you for like an hour every day, and you still wouldn't do much until you get out there and do it. Because how you are as a qualitative researcher really depends on the field. Like, it depends on you. I can teach you some tricks and tips, but you know, when you get out there, it's all on you.
When you teach your class at Delaware, do you have a theoretical piece and then a hands-on piece, and your students are expected to go through some of these sorts of...
Oh yeah, so with that particular class, we go over how to integrate, there's specific classes within that course on how to use theory to formulate your kind of research plan, and then how to reincorporate theory into your interpretations. But a lot of it, more of it is geared on hands-on. Students had to bring the data with them, and I don't know if you all will have data with you by January class, but if you did, that might be helpful. If you had like an interview transcript, even from a previous study, or if you all need it, I can provide some old ones and just to de-identify them. Because what I'd like to do is, if we have time, I don't know if we will, but it could be a practice at the end, is hands-on. Again, this is one of the biggest issues I run into with my grad students is that they're like, well, how do I do it? And it's like, you just got to do it. Like, you got to get in it. You know, there's ways of doing deductive and inductive coding, but it's a model. It's not a how-to, right? So you have to get in there and start digging in and really going through it. It's a really hands-on process, and so students really have to deconstruct that identity of there's one right way. And how do I know what I found? That's all about you as a scholar, you know, about what you found out, and you can keep on doing it. It takes practice.
Interesting is as a fellow,
Yeah.
we did some narrative analysis, and that was, you know, not necessarily qualitative, it was kind of quantitative because we were counting, and you know, but we were trying to pull out themes as well. You know, so I kind of know what that looks like. But it would be great if, you know, on the Excel website, you know, maybe you could put up some kind of shining star, you know, examples of qualitative research. Sometimes I feel like hearing this, I'm like, oh yeah, I get it, but what does that look like at the end? You know, when you do interviews, you know, what does the paper look like at the end of that? Like,
and I will, and then when I come in January, I will show you different types of, up here on slides, different types of way of presenting data. So one way, of course, is the frequency of, you know, here's a theme, here's an example of that theme from the data, here's the number of times that came up, here's the number of different people that said it, right? So that's one way. Then we go all the way to, here's the theme that was identified in the data, here's one quote that says it out of like the 30 people that we interviewed, here's one way of doing it. There's another way of doing it, like here's little blips from 10 quotes. So I'll show you all the different ways of presenting that data that are all acceptable, depending upon the journal you're looking for, or the report.
I think I know the answer to this, but it's worth asking. Does anybody think that they would have their actual data for their ACE project on January 14th?
That's fine.
Yeah, right.
Well, maybe what I'll do is
like,
I'll find.
Not so maybe you could find.
I'll find.
So you can plan.
I'll find some idea identified, and if we get to it, we'll get to it. You know, put it that way. Yeah. Because then we can all have inter-rater reliability. Yes.
So I had a question.
Yeah.
We were planning on doing interviews kind of to just inform us on our project. When you decide it's a IRB interview
You gonna publish it?
data well, we were gonna kind of just talk to people to figure out, like before we do our focus groups and our surveys, just for kind of knowledge gathering and trying to get information.
The two ways I'd answer that. One way is better safe than sorry.
Okay.
So go IRB in the beginning.
Okay.
You may even get exempt, because if you're not answering any asking any sensitive questions, they may just go for exempt status. But you never know what you may get with that interviews. You may get something very important that you want to use later on.
Okay.
And with the IRB, you therefore have a approval. Or the other way of looking at it is you know, you can do it, and then but you have to kind of keep that data completely aside. Okay. If you're ever dealing with human subjects, I always say go IRB. Okay. Because it just keeps you safe.
Well, and I've had, you know, journals will ask sometime for proof of exemption.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, no, I know.
Yeah.
We're doing the focus groups
it's
is part of the proposal, but we were also going to say, let's meet with Planned Parenthood people and do that just to have discussions, but weren't thinking that was part of our research project, but we're just having meetings with people.
I would say, given the climate right now, especially with Planned Parenthood, do it. Just do IRB.
There's that, isn't there?
Yeah, because then everything's on the up and up.
Don't worry, I'm not going to Planned Parenthood to have the meeting.
Well, I think if it evolves, I think that's, see, this is one of the coolest things about qualitative research is when there are events that happen, they do change the scene, and they may change your data, and these are things that you may not have even thought about happening, but I think, especially with having Planned Parenthood, I think now the dialogue has shifted, maybe not dramatically, but significantly, so that has to be taken into account in terms of how people may respond. So I would just always say, go IRB.
The interviews as part of this, as part of the research
We're going to do a pre-interview. Exactly, just to get a better understanding.
Of the field and,
Especially than sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you going to talk about credibility and all that related to validity of the data?
Well, yeah, in terms of, can you give me an example of what you...
I'm just trying to think in order for your data to be, results to be valid, credibility, what are some of the techniques that you can use, like proofreading, having the participants, can you talk about this? Because I think it's very important. What are the strategies to increase credibility of your data?
When I come in January, that whole is about, it's all about coding and analysis. And so we talk about how to go about properly coding so that you are seeing what you think you're seeing.
But that's for the coding, but now data collection is.
Oh, you want to do data? Oh, so in terms of data collection, well, I think the important.
There are strategies.
See, again, I kind of like to leave that open to researchers in terms of funneling everything into your research questions. So if you're looking at sampling, that's the first part, like who you're supposed to be getting, right? That has to do with your research questions in terms of what are you actually trying to answer. In terms of methodology, in terms of interviews or focus groups, again, it kind of comes down to what's the best way to get the data that you need to answer your research questions. The credibility all comes down to describe, like I said, show your work in terms of your actual techniques. That method that you use, and arguing that method is the key method for that particular type of study, and those research questions provide you the right to even talk about analyzing the data. Credibility and validity in terms of why you would use those.
Yeah, and reliability in terms of it's more about here is a transcript. Is the transcript accurate and accurately saying what the proofreading of the by the participants?
We talked about that a little bit in terms of
debriefing, all that.
You can. I mean, we can talk about debriefing in the next class if you'd like to.
Okay.
It's not always necessary. You don't have to debrief.
I struggle with publications. If there's none of that, happens, or if I don't report it, it might have happened, but I don't report it. They simply give me might be just my field that is quantitative, and just. That has been. It
comes into the idea of designing not only your informed consent, but also, of course, your IRB protocol, but then also designing the get out method. So when you leave these groups, if you're just interviewing one person at one particular time, if you feel like a debriefing is necessary, if you're bringing up sensitive topics, or you haven't described the study to begin with, from the get-go, then you may want to engage in a debriefing. This is what this study was about. Here's how this data will be used. If you ever want to see this data, that's all as the researcher, your prerogative, right? But if you have people who are publishing this saying, hey, we're not publishing this because you didn't debrief. Yeah, it's real. I have never run into an issue with debriefing. And I've dealt with
not just debriefing. Yeah. For example, if I have a sample of children, right?
Well,
it's very difficult to say that what they said is really what I'm interpreting correctly. So there's a lot of in between. How do you make sure that what I see is accurate, reflective of that can be seen and hear? Because if they have intellectual disability, for example, they can express themselves. A lot of it is through emotions, through their behaviors, and it gets into how do you validate your perceptions? How do you?
So that. Again, I think that can fall into coding. I would say in terms of inter-rater, if you're going to have two people. I think with sensitive subjects, I think I've seen studies where I had a colleague do a study on children drawing pictures of white children drawing pictures of the perceptions of black men and black women in jobs, and that was not. They only had it was a scholar, it was a student, I'm a grad student, and it was the parents had to be there at the time, of course, and then they were just engaged in a conversation with them, and with the student the kid as they were drawing the picture. And then that was all that was necessary. There was no, the informed consent was fine, and then there was a debriefing on that, and that's what the parents signed. Yeah. So their interpretation was the interpretation of that conversation and dialogue, and with the kid and the parent, and then their interpretation of that drawing. And so there was no backlash that they felt in terms of, hey, you should have had it. But of course, always better to have more eyes on something than not. Now, too many cooks, you run into that issue, but in terms of, hey, this is actually happening, you're going to want your team member to be in the same, if not the same room, looking over the transcript to say, here's what I saw. We've done that. It was you, me, and Brian, and we had the same thing. And we met after, I think, about 5 interviews and said, let's code a few, let's see how we're doing, and let's say we're coming up with the same stuff. Sure enough, we were. We wrote that up in the analysis section, saying, we engaged in this particular preliminary analysis part. We all had the same thing. Differences were kind of finalized by consensus, and we went from there. But
well, and I think there's a term for it, but it also reminds me that there's sometimes a formal process by which you do initial analysis of the data, and then you go back to one or two of the people that were in your group or stakeholders from your community,
you show them that.
And you show them what you know what I mean, like you show them what
you
did to
basically validate that these are representative themes and that they feel the same, that they have the same perception of that. It's kind of reaching back to the participants with your data.
We'll go.
Did we get it right?
Yeah. I know we talk about that in coding in the next class. This was more on here are the methods to use. Yeah. But in terms of validity of what you see, that's analysis.
Yeah. So. And I just think it's so important because it can really ruin your research. You skip some of the steps of make sure that your data are credible.
Oh, of course. Anyway. But yeah, if I tried to shove all that into an hour and a half, I would have gotten through any specifics.
Yeah. I just think, it's important that you look at it, like if you are going to do the qualitative, if you're going to use qualitative methods, they're almost always somewhat iterative, right? So you don't design, decide, and go all the way to the end to analysis, without some of these check-ins, so that if you're, to see if is your, even just as your study guide working, after you collect a few, you check in to see, like, are you, are the three of us or however many interpreting, going back to your group to say, are we getting it right? But I think, you know what I mean? Like, it's not quite the same as, throw out a survey, wait until it all comes back and analyze.
Because you have test research reliability. You have all these ways to feel that your data are trustworthy. In qualitative research, all is like there's so many little steps that I'm just learning as the field is developing. I think it's going through development as well. That sometimes I'm caught off guard, and this qualitative reviewer throws at me that I should have done that, and how come you haven't done it? I don't think it's these data are valid, so it's sometimes being up to speed with what the qualitative research, with the standards of qualitative research is very difficult.
It's interesting. So again, I think one of the issues that you run into with publication especially.
I'm talking publication more than.
With publication especially is the different perspectives of qualitative research and what it looks like and what it means to do it. So these standards, yes, there are standards of practice, but someone like myself, when I review pieces for qualitative health research or other journals, other qualitative journals, I'm focusing specifically on their analysis. Have they shown me exactly how they got from we use these codes, this is how we got this theme? I care about that.
Did you have that perception about other qualitative researchers?
No, that's the thing. Other qualitative researchers will say, I want to know why you didn't use another coder. Yeah. Why didn't you do this? And for me, personally, and I know there's people in my camp that would say, look, it's an interpretive process. Just showing that someone else got the same idea, doesn't always mean that that's exactly what's happening. There's always a relevant of, there's a postmodernism in this realm that is always being constructed, that just because you saw this at this one particular time, doesn't mean that that's exactly what it is, right? If two people saw it, gives it a little bit more validity. But I mean, honestly, I could easily argue that because they're on the same camp, they come from the same mindset, that they have the same ideas. The best way of doing it is to get someone who's in that group to say, does this smell right to you? Am I on the right track here? And then you're already halfway engaging the par. Might as well go full Monty on it and bring them right in. So, I mean, that's the thing. So it's an issue in terms of, with quantitative, I feel you can go in there and say, there's a specific test when the data looks like this, that's supposed to have this. With qualitative
references
methods,
for it, you can't go wrong, because if you know the procedure that has been published and has been there forever, you can refer to it and you say, this is what has been done. And in qualitative research, it seems that everybody has their own mind, just like in the research,
there's
right?
a huge issue with grounded theory, and I'll talk about that next class as well.
Yep.
You have everyone and their fathers and mothers using grounded theory, and they're not doing grounded theory. They're just doing inductive coding. They're not doing grounded theory. They're doing exploratory analysis with inductive coding. Everyone's like, it's grounded theory. Not grounded theory. So we'll go over that a little bit in the next class as well, but that's a whole other issue. So it makes the discipline look disjointed.
I agree.
So, and it's a problem. What I always say, and what I tell my students is, not only do you always show your work on every little step, but get previous research to back you on every little step. So-and-so did this similar study and used this particular method. This was, this is what they came out with. So-and-so did this. 3 to 5 other examples of similar things that people have done in the same kind of way provides a little bit, at least face validity of what you did and how you chose to do your methods. So that's the only thing I can really offer, besides if you want to, get other people to look at the stuff. Other researchers are great, but again, same mindset, so use the people in the field. It's always the most preferred.
Without looking at the research question, do you have a perception that qualitative researchers are going into quantity in terms of their sample size? Because that's what I've been seeing as well. That initially I remember studies like when I was in grad school with just 6 people, and that was fine to publish, and now 30 plus, please, I can't you shouldn't be publishing anything below that.
Yeah.
It's just the field is getting more and more challenged in a way, how you collect data and
how the methods are used.
From whom you collect the data.
It was always a very strenuous, I think, analysis and interpretation approach, but now in terms of methods of sampling, it is becoming more strenuous. You want more people to make sure you're getting that face validity of what you've got a representative sample. How can you be sure? So it's more or less of people aren't making the arguments in writing; they're making it in numbers. I'm saying so, which is good or bad in the field. There was a big push for narrative and qualitative interpretation in like the early 90s, late 80s, especially with health fields, and now it's like, so, we'll see. We'll see where the future goes. But next class will all be about coding, which is fun. Fun? Yeah, so if you guys have any questions, Heather has my email. Feel free to send it. I'll send it. I think you have the slides. Feel free to use them at your leisure. I put sites for particular things, so you guys can use that as well. Any specific questions about your project, please feel free to email me, and I'll see you in about a month. Yeah, awesome.
I'll check in with you about how much time you have.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
All right, you guys will take 5 minutes, and 5 minutes or less, we'll get back here at 10:45 or so. Okay, can you find Heather? Hey, Heather.
I did. Of course.
We're going to be done relatively quickly.
Yeah, we did a lot. Or we did some. Right? Is this the part we're doing, or no? We already did it.
It's a different.
All different things.
I do want to talk about the conference. We're presenting our abstracts or in the poster, or what is it?
So it's the same poster that you had. That's what I was wondering.
I don't have the poster. Off the top of it there because everybody did.
To do a whole new one?
I mean, I don't mind picking another one, but they should have it.
We borrow it, but it's like
tiny.
I don't mind redoing it. I probably have a better way. Like the pictures in there.
Maybe we could spell Jim's name.
Yeah. Let's start so quickly. And we should probably redo it. But it's not that, it's more, what are the expenses? So is our plan to next week, if possible, everything falls into place for Christmas, to meet with people at Matterwood? You said you were going to make your own connection
And I'm talking to,
or sometimes
It's so
like
exciting because
just
they
something
once they
something to kind of get me there.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
You know, I can see that.
It started, huh?
So yeah, like, every, I can't, like, it gets up in the
Not describing.
my eyes on it constantly.
It's not been my I hope it's not the cremation. Cadavers.
it could be.
Anyway.
Even start, like, I can't sit down.
So, what's your plan?
He goes to the doors, goes.
One more time, tell me, so you're gonna meet
I mean, even just, no, I'm gonna drive from
you're
here.
not like, I try to barricade them in a little.
You already have a kind of meeting with them?
No, I want to say,
He just
I
wants
want
to
to
spread
Sunday,
those germs.
Tuesday,
They're great.
Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday.
The classes like this, are they available online somewhere?
I'll just look up my Tuesday. I'm just gonna say, lay out.
Recordings have not been posted themselves.
Okay.
All of the presentations have been posted. They're all on the ACECurSession5
Curb kids.
Okay.
Go to the website, sign in.
But, so you're gonna meet with her sometime next week. The principal, right?
I'm gonna go with her.
Don't do that until you
Set the
get
date
the
to
rest.
tonight's Monday. We were all.
I'm always mentioning you. I need
Yeah,
to get them in.
yeah, that's Tuesday.
Okay.
Okay.
And I'm
So
gonna
that
do
would be
the
with the
same.
principal.
Yes, ma'am.
Under.
I mean, I have one.
Somebody above
The
her,
issue is
they're
it
fine.
expires and I have to do it again. So I don't know if we want the one I have now or the one
It
that.
has to be a valid sheet.
I mean, it's valid for now. It's just not won't be valid in a
We
couple
kind of have
months.
to go the steps,
Oh,
right?
as
We have to
long as
walk
it's
through
valid
it.
right now.
Yeah, it's valid right now.
That's what
Yeah.
you need to be able to show them you've been through the training. And, you know, they.
Yeah, so yeah, we'll get together soon.
Mary,
So the fact that
you
you
want
have
to bring
to do it
something
at some
in,
point,
my district
everybody
budget
knows
person,
that.
if we can
Okay.
get approved,
Okay.
or can you make it look like
But no, on that.
you guys make them at the district level, I'll have
On the
them do that.
website.
I'll send you these
You
next
should be.
slides.
If she can make it at her level, that's fine.
Go through and see if
But
it's
then
available.
it has to, there
All
is
of the
gonna have to be a
agendas
proposal
and that
that
Yes.
we have to submit
Yes.
to Red Flag.
Yes.
And that's where
that will
the
go to the
videos will be
superintendent.
Yes.
And you don't think that meeting superintendent is actually.
Okay.
The superintendent usually is gonna sign off. What I can do,
Is there a
even
particular
though
one
I
that
can
you're
say.
looking for?
I mean, just from the classes I missed, I was just wondering, and for my recent
All right, well, if
meeting,
anything comes up, just let me
to
know.
look at.
I think so, because they need to understand. Because,
Very good,
All right,
thank
no
you.
problem.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
no worries, no worries. See you later.
having,
See ya.
Okay.
because writing it or putting it on a paper or piece of challenging it.
Right.
It can look like we're trying to use them, but having the personal
Yes.
connection and a contact with them, I think it's.
It also will save the meeting too.
It will.
You know, if she gives you okay, then we can just adopt the proposal, and then,
I'm afraid they will not say okay. Personally, I'm worried. Not that we need to, but whoever will be in charge
Yeah.
of putting that through.
Yeah.
If superintendent doesn't have the power, which they do, but they may not have the power to approve a program, then we need to somebody who will be in that position.
what I think would be, director of special ed will give the recommendation to the superintendent, and there's pretty much a sign off.
If that's what,
Yeah, that's
how
just-
they
that's
do
just
it.
the protocol.
Yeah, because they have
Or,
stopped.
yes.
Stop my stuff.
Right.
Superintendent would stop my stuff and actually call me. I need you to revise your entire survey. Can you?
Yeah.
And it's like,
They've got a pretty easy superintendent.
Because she's dealt with them, she's dealt with like that Merv Tardy guy, right? About it, she tries
Merv's the
to.
one that has,
what his name was.
Oh, or was it,
Somebody and then sometimes it'll.
It wasn't bad. Actually, the principal died. It was special ed director. It was a she, and she was.
well, so now it's different,
No,
it's Sarah,
Sarah.
right?
Sarah's good, but the one who was, I mean, how long was she in that position?
I don't know, I'm trying to think who that person is.
It was about in 2008 when I went to visit her. And she pretty much sat next to me and said, "This is what you're gonna do." And I was like, "No, I'm not gonna follow your directions, your orders." It was horrible. That person was just so arrogant and altogether.
A female leaders.
An older female, not old, but she was not a young, like in her 30s or 40s. She was.
No, dude, you knew this coming in.
She was
Now
probably
you
in
see
her
how valuable
60s.
it
She
is.
was.
So now you gotta.
Wouldn't be surprised if she
you know,
retired.
you know?
That position.
But I
Anyway,
think, you know,
so I'm just glad that we don't do it.
not everybody.
And you want me to talk to Chani tomorrow?
You want to talk to them and see if we can
When's a good time next week if I can set something up? I'm pretty. I have on Monday is kind of busy.
And even just one last thing, the thing with that would get is that you can they feel like the most interactive sport.
The table, are you giving that to her at night? Oh, hey, that's probably making her crazier at night.
I know you
like
now on, and
no,
it's just
you might not do
eyes and everything. It's just sorry for it.
You should get home, sit outside in the sun and let it beat on your face and take a nap.
Oh my goodness.
And take a vitamin.
And then I'll do something. And then I'm like,
Oh, I got it.
So you did it. You can show it to him.
I'm not sitting in his seat.
I think I need to see.
Is over there more?
Directors for VNA, and Dina does all of the site memory thing. She works with Heather too. So she does, yeah. And then she does the community education of outreach. So they're talking about how there's.
Sorry.
Well, it's quite all right.
There you go. I was just stretching.
I knew your face would light up with that.
I'm a very patient person.
No more ideas today, please. No.
My home busy? Mine is really good at the restroom. Yeah, she's met Jim. Yeah.
Oh, he's great.
Actually, I think it's an idea. So you can do follow-up there, or you can do assessment, or after their initial, or like it could be a consult, like from like VNA or home file. Could be, like you see the person and you could be situations, you see them home for the next visit. There's so many people.
it's interesting, but what's the
Now it's got one that doesn't want to turn.
That's why and that's how I mentioned Andrea's team with me, because somebody has to be, if you find out somebody has they're homebound, they're qualified for a home visit, even if they're coming out for, you can come out to the appointment if it's ordinary, but if they have skilled nursing or homebound, it takes away that issue, because like that's a lot of what our citizens, when they make a first visit, they want to be homebound, so they don't send the doctor, not, you can't see a patient home.
So was the UK everything you had hoped?
We had a marvelous time. Had a horrible flight over, and I was afraid that was going to be.
What was weather?
No. It was the fat man didn't fit in the seat, and there were two of us side by side trying to share space that was only designed for you.
According to
Right. And there just was no way to get into a comfortable position to do anything. Then my headset didn't work. Then my plug-in to charge my phone didn't work. The whole receptacle for the plug-in was missing somewhere in the back of the seat. But the visit was great. The stuff that we saw was phenomenal. We averaged walking about 6.5 miles a day. My daughter was tracking her steps, type of thing.
You want to do that?
From outside to here.
So that was pretty cool. I injured my knee. I don't know how seriously, because I don't want to know right now. But I ended up with a leg brace on and just plowing through it. And I had no problem really.
I remember when I was pregnant, these kind of smells.
I thought I might, but Saturday we came back in the afternoon. I made myself stay up until 10. Got up at 5:45 Sunday morning.
Just a quick question for Dina. Are you hanging out? I am. Okay, Tim, you're gonna stay. Okay. Well, here's what I'll tell you what we're gonna do, and then you can tell me kind of what you think. So we're gonna go team by team. I'm gonna ask you to say aloud your research question. Depending on how that goes, then we're gonna do specific games. Just to kind of see where everybody is on that, and to work on them in terms of development as a group, to see that you're kind of have them both down. And so since it's a group by group thing, that's why I was asking. Do you want to do your own research questions, specific games? Do you want to just listen and participate in the discussion?
I would love to listen.
Okay. All right. And so then Dina's out. So then we really just have the 1, 2, 3, 4 teams. to work on. So that means we have an hour. We can do about 15 minutes each. The way I'd like to do it is to go with one team, research question specific games, as far as we can get in that 15 minutes, and then we'll go to the next team. All right, and I am like anal, but I'm going to set my timer because otherwise, you could talk about any one of these for a long time. Oh, look at that. I apparently started my stopwatch a long time ago. I wonder, these are the things that happen. Then you're like, I wonder why my battery on my phone just doesn't seem to last very long. So, funny to me. All right, so we'll just go. Kim, let's start with you. You're looking at me. All right.
Look at Heather, get picked on. Remember that.
No eye contact.
Or try. No,
All
I'm
right.
kidding.
So, I said this to give us the 12-minute warning. So why don't, actually to pick on, Andrea, why don't you, as best you can, give us your first, iteration here. What is your research question for your ACE project?
Ready?
I am ready.
All right.
And I think one thing before, if I could ask for a little feedback, I think we got our research question a little into specific territory as we talked last time, because we kind of developed this using the, the PICO format, which then was also used again for students. So if anyone can give feedback on that, that would be. We have some areas kind of in our introduction that might be a little more fitting for research question, a little broader, but tell us what you think. Sure. I like it.
She likes it.
Do you like it?
I like it.
We like it.
So we will evaluate a homebound patient population for knowledge of palliative care and general health status, utilizing a telephone survey administered by a research assistant.
Okay, so that is a specific game. It sounds very much like that. So evaluate, go ahead.
A homebound patient population for knowledge of palliative care and general health issues, utilizing a telephone survey.
Okay, so this to me is a specific game, which is good. We need those too. But truly, a research question should be a question. So as best you can, without looking at papers or anything, why are you doing this?
So
why are you doing the whole project?
Yeah, so what we want to do is we want to get the chronic patient population in whatever geographic area we do to give us their understanding of palliative care versus hospice care versus traditional home care. And then the second part of the question is what their understanding of their sense of well-being is.
Okay. Okay. So let me take a stab at it. I'll probably get it wrong. In fact, I won't believe you if you tell me I got it right. So you're kind of getting at something like, what is the sense of well-being in our, and I'm not going to go into details, but in your population, and how does that relate to understanding of palliative care, hospice care,
home health,
and home health? Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think we're saying understanding, but in truth, you want to know preference. You're kind of assuming that their understanding is going to determine their preference, but it sounds like where you want to land is understanding what do they want.
What do they want? Right. And what do they understand? I mean, if they have it in place, then we know.
Let me try again. And so then I think actually to back it up a little further, because the research question is the broader umbrella. This one doesn't work for me so well. What is preference maybe desire for hospice, palliative care via home health in our patient population.
I think a way we
so do you think that does that sound like your research question? Or am I putting words into your mouth?
No, it does. No,
okay,
so it sounds like a very good, concise version of it. I feel like we have a couple different points, kind of like your work, but I think overarching, we use somewhere in our initial application that we wanted to assess, readiness. We're not really assessing readiness, but, I would say, in a way we are, readiness and interest. Because patients already have things like advanced directives and power of attorneys, they have a greater readiness. We've already started proceeding with the process. So we kind of said assess readiness and interest in palliative progressing patients perceived an actual level of illness. Okay. I think that's similar.
Anybody else have any thoughts, comments on this in terms of a research question before we take it and make it into specific games? And remember, the research question is the one we want to evaluate. Is this a feasible question? Interesting, really only you guys can decide to some degree, although, for publication purposes, you would hope that other people find it to be an interesting question. Novel, ethical, and relevant.
Do we need to pull those things into it? Is this something where, a research question needs is kind of the very first sentence of it? Go into the other aspects, or do you just need to look at this one sentence and say, okay, that is novel?
I think I would put it this way. I think in terms of actually doing the research, regardless of the writing of the proposal or the publications, you need to start with a good, solid sense of what is the question I want to answer.
So I think what she's asking is it a question or is it a paragraph?
Yeah, it's a question.
It's a question.
Okay, so I think that's
isn't that what you were kind of trying to figure out?
Yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to figure out.
Yeah.
Because I know, understanding, I think we've understood kind of what our basic question is. It drilled down, I think, a lot more. But, I just wasn't sure in terms of, follow along with PICO. Is it, how much do you have to go into it?
Yeah, and PICO is specific aims. So
Okay.
to me, the research question gives birth to the specific aims.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
Right? So the research question, might even be 2 or 3 projects before you were to answer it. But the research question then gives birth to specific aims of the project at hand.
We can
Something like that. There may be siblings. All right, so this is your specific aim, right? To evaluate a homebound population, knowledge of palliative care,
general health status.
And health status. My shorthand. Eva, what do you think? Would you be able to take that specific aim and operationalize it? So let me ask you this. Do we think that this is specific? Homebound patient population.
I don't think so. There's target population. There's a target population, but it's not specific. You identify what very broad.
Right.
Be lost in it.
So, and we have insider knowledge, right? So you're saying that you're going to evaluate this population, a population of homebound patients. To me, looking at that as, from both hats, you're not evaluating all homebound patients. There's limitations that I know of. So you could, if you, for instance, are going to say a convenience sample, that is one way to communicate immediately that, I'm not, look, Mr. Hard Reviewer or Mrs. Hard Reviewer or Dr. Hard Reviewer. Like, I'm not saying that I'm going to measure this entire population. I'm going to take the first steps in my particular population that's available to me. And immediately that's going to communicate to me the limitations of generalizability. So, you're saying, nope, I'm not trying to, make a point that this is generalizable to all homebound patients. I'm just starting with what I have. Or you know, you can say convenience sample, or you could specify what you know. You know, that this is, you know, a statewide.
That's kind of our next portion. You can maybe backing this up, you can tell me if it's too much or not enough. Like immediately following that, we said that patients would be determined as homebound through enrollment in DNA. They would be cognitively intact, reside in northern Delaware, be served by Christian Care VNA, and have chronic diseases including but not limited.
Okay.
I mean, we didn't want to include that all in the initial sentence, but we wanted to include it and really drill it down because you're right, homebound fast. And, you know, I mean, I guess that's kind of all one.
Okay. So you're gonna enrolled in VNA. That would not belong in the specific games to me. Okay. And because that doesn't mean anything to anybody but you. Northern Delaware you might include, or the word regional. Having, you know, chronic disease. It's fine to say that you're going to say that that's put that in the specific games and worry about how do you define, you know, chronic disease later on, and put that information later. And that matters to me, right? Because, you know, when I'm, you know, putting it out there and I'm trying to, you know, maybe I'm evaluating this in terms of, you know, a grant mechanism that is supposed to be helping people with chronic disease. So it helps me to know that, yes, you know, you're talking about things in the purview of area of interest.
Chronic disease, region. Basically taking that and making it look like it's a little bit more broad, something that could apply to other groups.
Well, don't make it, I'm not saying to make it what it's not. I'm just saying that you want to really communicate in those specific games what it is in terms of generalizability. Is it just a pure convenience sample, take all comers, you're going to have this little mixed bag? You know, you want to begin to allude to sort of your inclusion and exclusion criteria, but in a more summative way. Okay. You know, so I know, like, you know, if I say chronic disease, I'm going to define that in 5 ways, and then I'm going to exclude people, you know, in 3 other ways. But
so I guess I'm still struggling with. So we have that. You know, some of it probably needs to, yes, be tweaked, but we have that information. But I guess, when do you do less and when do you do more? And then, like, I guess you know, how you present that information. Like, how early on in, like, when you identify one of the aims, so we say that this is an aim, but we have the specifics of what our definition of homebound is. So when you're putting that together, I'm having a hard time seeing how it flows.
I think initially, especially last week, I had a little trouble too. It seems like specific aims. What story are we trying to tell with specific? You know, there's lots of different parts to the story here. We have some specifics and some not specifics, but you know, what story are we trying to tell here?
And is it specific or is it general? And then, you know, because you said, you know, you asked the question about, is this really we're trying to get the information from a general group? Well, we're looking at preferences, and for me, if depending on what our sample size or what that population is that we're surveying, it could be considered generally the preference of the homebound population with this sense of well-being chooses this path versus when they have this sense of well-being they consider.
Yeah, and I don't entirely get the message. I think one easy question that I heard in there is you could put essentially you would put a word like homebound in your specific aims, and I don't think you have to go further in your specific aims, but you darn well better, you know, define in your methods what homebound means and how how are you defining it. Because there is a lot of different, you know, choices to be made on that.
One of our aims would be we will evaluate population, a regional area of northern Delaware with preponderance of chronic disease for knowledge of palliative care general health.
Can I ask a question? I don't want to take too much of you guys' time, but as medical professionals, do you use the word population differently than what population means? Or like research statistics? way. Like, to me, population of students is everybody's a student, and a sample is a chunk of them that I collect up. Do you guys think of, you speak differently? I'm just,
Yeah, I use population.
you use population a lot, and I just want to make sure.
I use it congenially, I think, because, our homebound population, our elderly population, our CHF population, I think creeps into my language in a very congenial way.
So, the other thing I'm gonna say, sort of, looking at this, you say you're gonna evaluate using a telephone survey. Usually when you talk about, a specific aim, there's to evaluate knowledge via a survey. Sounds to me like you're measuring a quantitative thing, and I don't think you are.
Measuring some quantitative.
Okay. So somehow that needs to kind of end up in here to...
Because we have, the other specific aims we have, just to throw them out to see if it's kind of seeing the big picture, if it changes that is, the survey will identify knowledge of palliative care by determining the presence of advances in surrogate decision-making through direct. Through what? Direct questions. We're just going to ask them, do you have power of attorney? Do you have no yet? That's the way we're going to directly identify some knowledge of palliative care. And then the other, aim that we have was participants' health status and perception of health will be assessed using self-reported, standardized, validated tools. Then our other aim is driving skilled nursing, palliative care, and hospice to participate. The participants and determine what type of program they would prefer for their current health.
Say that last one again.
We will describe skilled nursing, palliative care, and hospice services to the participants and determine which type of program they would prefer for their current health.
I just got to ask a question. So palliative care can go along with curative care. Mm-hmm. You're specifically excluding that group from your study population?
No, we're including everyone in the study population, and we're asking them about a curative care route, which is skilled services, a palliative care route, which we'll describe as being able to be provided along with curative services, focusing towards quality of life, and a hospice service, not provided along with curative care.
Which is, in a sense, palliative care with an end-of-life goal?
It is. So we have this great diagram that we always draw out where essentially when you're diagnosed with your disease, you can start palliative care along with it. It's a little bit less at first, but it grows as your disease progresses, and then at the end we normally act on with hospice. Hospice does palliative care, symptom assessment and control, but it's just along the spectrum of palliative care. And it's a specific Medicare benefit to provide palliative care.
So is one of your specific aims then, you really want to know where the patient views themselves?
Yes, where they view
which
themselves.
Might not be the same as where the healthcare provider team views them clinically.
And we want to assess that too. So we want to assess where the healthcare team views them in a more subjective sense, where the patient views themselves in a more objective sense, and then we also wanted to do a scale where the patient is subjectively. So looking at where the patient is according to a scale, looking at where the patient thinks they are, and looking at where the healthcare provider ranks.
Gotcha.
In addition to just doing some attitudinal work, like, do you have an advanced direct?
And soon, demos.
Demos, yes. Okay, we actually should include that.
I'm kind of hearing, and you can take this for what you're worth, what it's worth, and maybe come back. Certainly, I'm always available. Bring it back to me, the group, via email. But it sounds like what you're saying, you want to quantify the knowledge of primary care, the knowledge of palliative care using some standardized tools.
Yes.
In a homebound population, blah, blah, you want to measure the proportion of individuals with advanced directives and power of attorney, POC. Point of care. It takes far too many acronyms, but I can't write as fast as I think.
Yeah,
understand and describe the patient preferences regarding palliative care, et cetera, after brief education, via telephone survey. You know what I mean? Like you want those other like pieces of information in each of these, but it sounds like something like this is what the 3 aims you're.
I think you've absolutely got them. Absolutely.
So
I think that is it. So it's the knowledge of palliative care. I would kind of say that of palliative care. Actually, probably you can put the health status there. You know, quantify their knowledge of their health status, the proportion of patients with these advanced knowledge that we quantified. Yeah, I think we can put those in those buckets.
Dry race.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Who wants to go next?
Let me go next.
All right.
Alone today.
Bruce Springsteen on my mind because he's gonna come on tour. So I'll try and incorporate a Bruce Springsteen quote whenever possible. You're alone, you're alone. All right. Research question.
What are Delaware parents of teens' knowledge, attitudes, and setting preferences for LARC? It's parents of teens.
Questions, comments other than me?
It's very clear. I mean, you have your population, you have your region.
And I'm not sure, maybe the group can help me. The only thing I would say when I hear this is in my mind, I wonder if you're asking a little bit of a bigger research question, because in the end, I wonder if what you're really asking is, almost, it seems that maybe it is too broad. Maybe the question behind the question is here: how do we
increase access? I mean, that's
how do we give them what they want? Like, what do people, what education and support and settings, are needed to increase access. Because essentially, I mean, I guess the thing is, if the answer were like they don't want it, they hate it. You know what I mean? Like that's not anyway. Just anybody.
That comes up a lot. Is what if they say that? And I think that's the next research project, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the overall thought is how can we increase the access of this form of birth control to this population? And so that's kind of the big picture where we could do tons of projects about that. The first step is we decided to focus on parents because a lot of people are teens. Mm-hmm. And that's where the controversy, I think, comes in, is you focus on the teens and the parents are pissed. You get into issues. So that's why we picked out this question first, is what do the parents do that? But if they tell us, you know what, we think this is completely inappropriate for our teens, it should never be used, then that's our next research project, is how do we change that? So we decided to use that theory of reasoned behavior, because that's kind of what we're trying to do, is we need to figure out where they're at so we can know what needs to happen. Maybe they are completely fine with the method and they just we have to talk about where it happens, or maybe they're completely not fine with the method, or maybe they're fine if doctors do it but not fine if school does it. So that's where we are at, or fine if they know about it but not fine if the kid gets it without their parents' knowledge. That's
okay. I mean, feasible. Anybody concerns about the feasibility of this? Interesting, novel. I actually like that you're starting with parents. I do think that you're right. Like, you're not going to get. It's like the lion at the gate. You're not going to get too far unless you embrace that. Ethical and obviously relevant. So I'm happy. Anybody concerns, questions? Okay. So give us your aims.
So that's where it's tricky. So I think the first aim we had, and I don't know if this should be an aim, was to educate parents about LARC, because you can't ask them what their knowledge is, because like many of you guys are like, what's LARC? But so
let's hear the other ones, and then maybe in context, the puzzle will come together.
So we want to educate the parents first, and then the second one is to understand parental preferences about the use and administration of LARC.
Okay.
And the third one was to disseminate the results of our research to healthcare providers, policymakers, and educators.
Tell me the second one again, because I didn't write quickly enough.
Sure. Understand parental preferences about use and administration of LARC.
Well, let me ask you this: when you think about the education, are you going to do some work to find out what they know and then educate based on that work, or are you going to educate and you know what I mean? Like, tell me just the order in which you envision these things.
So what we're planning on doing is starting with focus groups first. So I guess we would use a semi-structured interview question. And the first question would be, do you know what the term LARC or long-acting universal protection or IUDs or implants or Mirena or Nexplanon, depending on, so like, do you know what these are? That would be the first, like the opening up.
Okay.
And so then depending on what, you can't really have any more questions asking about their preferences if you don't know what it is. So if everybody says, oh yeah, we're familiar, then we'll move on to the next questions. If they don't, then our facilitator is going to have to explain this is.
So you're not going to educate them for just.
Yeah.
I'm looking at an order here, and I'm.
Yeah.
It's not like this is what LARC is. Here's and then surveillance, figure out, or a focus group. It's figure out the focus group.
Yeah.
And then
the parents there. I mean, we're gonna. So I think it depends, right? Maybe they don't need much education. Maybe they know what it is, but don't know that term. You know.
But I think it's interesting that you put education before understanding preferences, because the education could potentially change what the preference would be, where they might be like, oh, you know, the one in the uterus versus the one in the arm, but then when they're educated about it, it could potentially change that preference regarding use.
Right.
Versus people who are not educated about it and haven't had that knowledge.
Right.
Like, ooh, it's scary, that one needs a procedure, you know.
Exactly. And it's not meant to be like convincing education, but just kind of starting with that is a form of birth control where it's implanted in the uterus or implanted in the arm that lasts for 5 years and 3 years. You may have heard the term Mirena or Nexplanon, not like, oh, and it's safe and effective and all that stuff, because that would be changing their impression, but this is...
It's awareness.
This is awareness. You need to know what it is before I can ask you questions about it.
You also get a chance of doing it in this order to counter negative publicity from past times.
Right.
Because that's one of the things we ran into just last week in a discussion among family members is everything they knew about it was from 20 years ago, and well, not a chance. You're not putting that in my daughter, you know.
So it sounds to me like that you're going to have this focus group. You're going to kind of start open-ended, finding out what they know already about LARC.
Right.
Sort of in a responsive way at the time, in the moment. Then you're going to say, here's what it is.
Yeah.
And then after that, so it's going to be like a little bit of get their information. You're going to provide the education, and then it's going to be after you've educated them, so that they, you know, just basically filling in the gaps. If they totally know about it,
right?
I mean, say you get a group that's like, you know, the LARCs are us parents anonymous. You're gonna probably skip the education.
Right, they have them right now.
You know,
oh yeah, that's in my arm.
Yeah, because I mean, some people in a focus group might be, oh yeah, I mean, kind of following along with the group, saying that they know more about it than what they may.
Right, and so we're gonna have to train people to tease it out when the person's like nodding, like, you know, how are they going to assess that everybody in that room actually knows what we're talking about?
Sometimes, you know, I mean, you probably do it clinically too, and I'll just, as a reminder.
right.
You know.
Yeah. So yes, educate.
So I think that education is not an aim then.
You think it's not an aim?
Yeah,
okay.
I don't think it's an aim. I think you want to understand. I mean, I guess because it's not. You're not researching the education. You know what I mean? You're just sort of saying, if they need it, we're going to give it.
Right.
It's not like you're giving different, like,
yeah, that's why I said now
we're
looking
testing
back at it.
an A and a B education model to see if whether or not people respond to it.
So maybe it's part of understanding because it's more of defining, right? So that's probably part of the understanding aim. And the method that we're going to do to understand is to define it, maybe. But, you know what I'm saying? So.
Well, more importantly, here's what I was thinking.
Sure.
That's good, right? That's a good way to be. Hold your thoughts best you can, because I was totally doing that thing where you were talking and I was thinking about what I was thinking. So the first step is you're gonna reveal this parental, knowledge about LARC. After you respond to it by educating or not, educating a little, educating a bunch, you're gonna try and understand their preferences about the use, administration, and settings that make sense for LARC, right? So to me, those are your two aims.
Okay.
And frankly, and again, Eva, I'm going to look at you as the experienced researcher in the room. I think when you say disseminate results, that's not an aim. That's kind of understood. That's like of course you have, that's the culture of research. Of course you will disseminate.
That would be the program.
results.
If you have a program, then part of your goal is to disseminate research.
So I think we've added that because we're going to have a forum at the end where we are going to talk about our results and then talk to the school-based health centers, private pediatrician, like the people that would actually have to provide access and say, hey, this is what parents say. Now, how are we going to increase LARC use given what parents say? So that's why we put that as
So my question to you
Yeah.
is, are you trying to create a program and you're really doing a needs assessment?
It's so the background of where the question came
Where you
from.
had it
So I don't
before.
know, but the background of where the question came from is a lot of the places where kids are getting birth control don't provide LARC. And then I'm one of those places, although we're in the process of doing some of that, and then my co-investigator is also in charge of one of those. And both of our hesitancies are if kids come in on their own, it's kind of acceptable to do birth control and shots and that type of thing, but implanting devices in people without parents knowing kind of makes us feel comfortable, and we do this for a living. And given past issues with Medicaid, people need to have Norplan or you're in prison and the judge says you have to, whatever, but you have to be sterilized or whatever things that have happened in the past, we want to be careful saying, oh yeah, in this school we're going to provide this service without their parents knowing because it's West Philly High School and those kids should all not have babies, like those type of settings, or jail or some other places where people might get birth control.
What I'm hearing though then is not so much that you're disseminating your results, but rather that you're taking these results and engaging stakeholders to get their input on how might you disseminate this.
Right.
Which
or
is a
how
little
we
bit
might use people's thoughts to in a cultural competent way increase access and not just say we are the healthcare, your daughter needs birth control and we're going to provide it regardless of what you think, which is what we normally do.
So yeah, I think that this is just you sort of oversimplified and undersold yourself a little bit.
Okay.
What you're doing is you're engaging your stakeholders and using your results from 1 and 2 to understand what might be the best ways to implement it. Is that?
And then it goes into really some kind of into the strategies you're going to implement it in terms of a programmatic. You're going to have some kind of a program with that, right? Who is going to?
So that would be the next
charge?
grant.
Who's going to be in charge? So you really definitely finding out what's out there, what needs to be done, what's the best way of getting it done,
right?
Things like that. Yeah.
Right.
So there's a lot that has to happen in terms of developing the material, the instructional material, and things like that, in order for you to know that whatever your instructional material is, that it truly educates the parents, right?
Right.
You can come up with something, but the workshops or whatever, you have to still prove effectiveness of it. So quite a long way to do a program, but it's somewhere it has to start.
The first step of getting what does the community feel? Are they like, oh no, or are they like, sure, I think this is great, it should be available everywhere. And I don't really know the answer to that question.
That matters. I mean, you might have to back the whole way up from program development to education.
Right.
Well, and I was just going to say,
I
would sneak in a couple of post-focus group questions to make sure that whatever education you provided, to see if it actually, you know what I mean, like just 2 or 3 questions to assess did your education actually, was it effective?
Did it translate into actions, right?
Right. Oh, well, I was
In
actually
the focus group or like a survey afterwards to see knowledge?
I was thinking literally if I'm teaching you about LARC, in this focus group, before the end of the group, or right at the end of the group, I hand you a 3-question thing that essentially you answer, and then I know, if you're still saying, Mickey Mouse and Friends is the answer, that I didn't quite, you know what I mean? So that not only, do I, know that the knowledge and attitudes and perceptions I'm getting are still from a fairly uneducated group, but also that I know whatever methods I chose to educate you are not the ones going forward.
Right.
What I'm missing here is a theoretical framework. I just struggle. I live in this confound of it has to have some kind of framework, because I've developed attitudinal, follow theoretical frameworks to develop instruments, and I miss it here. I just miss what you're really, I think that can be answered after you've done some of the elicitation, right?
So we were doing the theory of reason, action, and planned behavior.
Yeah, that's
talking
what
about
I use
attitudes toward behavior, social acceptance, and that's kind of a thought.
You really is collecting information for the beliefs, less for the attitudes, because the beliefs drive the attitudes. So, still, you're going to struggle. How is it translated into actions? You may collect information about intentions, but unless it's that it was translated into actions, it would be hard to prove that it actually results in it.
Right, but we're not trying to do an action or translate into action. We just want to know what's out there, how people believe, and then give that to and tell healthcare providers, this is what this community of parents believes about this issue. Now this is what we need to do to increase access to these devices to this group. But we're not trying to, and I think that's where a lot of the reviewers said, well, how's this going to change their behavior? We're not trying to increase access. We're trying to get the knowledge so that we can tell the healthcare providers.
What is the behavior?
The behavior is going to be is using these forms of birth control in teens. So that's the behavior. But we're not trying to.
Using? What do you mean using?
So getting and using that as a form of birth control, as opposed to no birth control or other forms of birth control. So we're trying to increase the amount of teens that are using implants as forms of birth control as opposed to no birth control.
Are you measuring that sort of as a next step? That's not part of this? Or?
That's not part of this at all. The first step is because, again, they're going to places that don't even offer these methods, and the places aren't comfortable with offering these methods to teens for a variety of different reasons. And one of the ones that we brought up is the big thing of, trying to avoid, I say, being on Fox News and the protest outside of the place. And did you know this place could implant a device in your 12-year-old without your permission? And
it's really different, right? There's a big push that we know that these are way more effective than pills and all the other things that we've used.
Right.
But the two big LARCs are IUDs, so putting something in the uterus, and in your arm implants that would have to then be taken out by another procedure.
Yeah.
So it's very different. Whereas I think for the culture of doing providing pills to teenagers that come in on their own has kind of become acceptable.
40 years.
Do you know what I mean? That's been going on. Some people may not like it, but it certainly isn't creating people with picket signs.
Right.
This stuff could very well.
And they're doing it in the high schools also amazingly without protest or even knowledge that you can already go to high school and get a Depo shot and birth control pills without your parents knowing. And
we have rampant unplanned pregnancies, especially in teens, and we know that these are far more effective.
Right.
So there's a lot of interest.
But this goal is not even at all to increase any intentions. Oh, now I want my daughter to sign up for LARC. We're just trying to get the information so now we can go to these healthcare providers and you know what? Parents think it's safe is with these caveats. Or parents don't think it's safe and we got to step back and do a major public health campaign saying that it's safe.
But there needs to be some ultimate goal, right?
The goal is to increase access to LARC for teens.
That's so that's what you need to be driven. All the questions need to be driven by that.
We have really high unintended pregnancy rates, and one way to do that is to increase access. So that's the goal. Is we want to increase access, but we have to figure out how.
It's interesting because we have a unique system of these school-based health centers that a lot of people aren't aware of and don't know of practices in the schools where a lot of teens access this. So it's a whole different. even a different picture in Delaware, which I think makes it even
Right.
more interesting, where we have a setting that a lot of other communities don't have to provide this, but they're not providing it.
Right, and neither is ARC, where a lot of, for 40 years, they're going to have their 40-year anniversary, they've had a free clinic where kids can get birth control for 40 years. They also don't provide it. So some of the big settings where kids can access care on their own, and the highest risk kids theoretically are the ones that can't talk to their parents and are accessing kids on their own, so you want to be able to provide it. And so that's why I was talking about interviews at Planned Parenthood, because I don't know if they are providing it without parental consent, the implantable devices, and so that's what I thought I was going to talk to them, but I guess now we'll official interviews, and if maybe they're doing it, maybe they can tell us, oh, this is our experience and whatnot. But as far as I know, my clinic isn't doing it, ARC isn't doing it, school-based health centers aren't doing it. So unless you're going to a private gynecologist, I don't think it's happening.
All right, so these were just my, did you get my quick best pass?
I did.
Not that you have to.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, I want to go next. I'm sorry that I was writing, but I was trying to really sketch it for us. So our research question is, we have a community integration program that we are working on. So what is the effectiveness of the community integration program on the levels of daily physical activity, health-related fitness, physical fitness, and self-determination of individuals with intellectual disabilities ages 19 to 44 years?
That was so fast. What is the effectiveness?
So what is the effectiveness of the community in CIP on the levels of you can just say just physical activity, health-related, or just say physical fitness, self-determination of IID, you can say, IID, young IID, or young adults with IID, or with ID, sorry.
What is ID?
Intellectual disabilities.
Okay. So what is the effectiveness of this program on physical activity, physical fitness,
self-determination,
in this population of young people with intellectual disabilities?
And our specific aim at the moment is to evaluate the effectiveness of the technology, of the system of least prompts, SLP, combined with video prompting, VP, on the acquisition of muscle strengthening exercises of this population, basically young adults with ID. It's hypothesized that participants will provide, while provided with video, verbal, and or physical prompts, would independently acquire all steps of the selected muscle strengthening exercises and be able to generalize the acquired steps when participating in a community-based program such as the YMCA. So our idea is to establish procedure in which they best learn exercises that are too complex and difficult for them to comprehend. And by using video modeling or using assistive technologies such as iPads, they will be presented with these videos and with these steps over and over, and it will help aid in consistency of the instruction that is provided to them by different people. In our study, it's going to be just instructors so we can eliminate other confounds. But in the future, in this program, this instructional video is going to be supplemented with prompting, is going to be used to promote their participation and potentially even adherence, since they will be more motivated to continue to exercise. The idea is to look at their daily physical activity, because we first have to establish this is a sound methodology to use to increase
to teach them these exercises. Once we know once we have data for that, we'll go further and use this technology, this system, to promote their physical fitness. And also self-determination, which is subdivided into increasing their autonomy, relatedness, and confidence, or kind of somewhat competence in exercising. So that's how we're looking at it. And the model is basically going to be using this particular technology. So it's really looking at so many steps that we have to go through to prove the effectiveness of the model, but this is just one element of it.
Two questions that would help me. So the system of
least prompts
is being compared with video.
No, they're going to be used together.
They're going to be used together.
There's no comparison. There's just to evaluate the effect, whether it works or not, on their acquisition of muscle strengthening exercises.
What does success look like?
Basically, they independently can acquire it. Because there are people with intellectual disabilities who will never acquire. So our idea is to establish somewhat what's the most effective way of teaching them complex exercises, that multi-step exercises. There's always going to be success, some kind of, we don't know what the effect is, whether it's positive, negative. We just want to know what's effective, whether it is using a lot of prompts at the beginning or at the end. At the moment, we want a system of least prompts. So we start with as little prompting as we can, and we continue adding prompting. We're hoping that potentially the people will not need any prompting and will only be able to use just the videos as they go in to do an exercise on their own in the fitness center. But it's a little more complex. I think it's hard to explain in a few sentences. It's better to see it than it's just too complex.
Okay, but I guess so. First, everyone's getting the same thing.
Yep.
Okay. And in terms of, changing the number of prompts, is that happening?
We're going to be calculating the percentage of prompting they're getting.
Okay.
But that is not going to be what is going to determine the effectiveness. The effectiveness is going to be whether or not within a certain time frame they were able to accomplish or achieve the steps or master the steps of the exercise independently with just the video prompt.
Okay.
So the idea is to remove and provide as little prompt delivered by the instructor as we can, and just let them go off on their own with just the video prompt to remind them these are the steps you need to follow.
So they will be taught with the video all along, and then gradually the instructor portion who's kind of helping explain the video or prompt the video.
Correct. It will be removed so that...
But it will be both initially with the goal of just being able to use the video prompt.
Mm-hmm. We're developing at the same time instructional material for what it takes to actually get them to that point. Okay. So we don't know what it takes. We don't know how much prompting we're going to use, and we're going to see differences across as we start doing a group design. Initially, it's going to be a single subject, multiple baseline with a few subjects, but we're hoping that within this year, we're going to be able to do both group design and the pilot multiple baseline. So with that, we haven't decided because we're probably just going to do the pilot, a single subject design, very simple with only 3 participants to make sure that all the technology is, the instruction and everything is kind of tweaked out. We have no surprises along the way, and once we know that our procedures are clean and are sound, we're going to go into using a group design. Because this population is so hard to find that using, there's so few of them that kind of using them up for, without having a sound protocol would be really undesirable.
So if I understand, the first person that comes in, the first young person with intellectual disabilities, they're going to have this video running, and they're going to have an instructor. And you're going to have someone watching all of this.
Watching. There's going to be video. They're going to be recorded. The whole entire procedure is going to be video recorded.
Right. And so at this point, it runs. life happens as it's going to happen. They will ask for the number of prompts they need. The instructor will kind of decide when to intervene. And when you are back there watching that video, you're going to be measuring how much additional instructor prompting was needed.
Correct.
And overall, how long did it take for them to do it?
And really the idea
get to
is
the point where the instructor could essentially not be there.
Correct. And that is going to be measured by, because each person is different. That's the problem, that with people with intellectual disabilities, you can't standardize it and say, oh, this is the best strategy for everybody. It's not. It's always going to be individualized, and I think that's the challenge we are getting, and why a lot of research is not very successful, is that we're trying to say, as long as how long it takes doesn't matter, as long as they are capable of learning. And how long it takes 14 weeks, it takes 20 weeks, doesn't matter. If we continue to see improvements, we are talking about stability. If we see that in 5 days they haven't improved, that's the end, and the person basically didn't learn. And that is telling us that we need to do more. But if we see that all of them have learned, it just took a little longer, and we eventually were able to step out and have them do it on their own with just an iPad going around the fitness center, then that's our success. How it happens in between is this study is going to reveal what are the steps that we need to take, because nobody knows that there's no literature on what it takes for these kids, basically still kids, to learn, for these young adults to learn these exercise machines, or how to exercise on these machines. Because it's a pretty challenging process, and put in a perspective the community and everybody exercising, this noise and this machine looks a little different than what I learned. The weights are in the back, no longer on the side, variability. So we are looking into, once they learn it in a safe setting, in kind of a lab setting, will it actually transfer into the gym, right? Will they be able to just take the iPad and go and exercise on their own? Initially, only we're going to be doing it with 2 exercises. We don't want to just put ourselves like an enormous amount of data, but potentially we are hoping like having 15 videos. Once we know that this is effective, and we know what worked and what didn't work in the video or with the whole procedure, we'll develop about 15 instructional videos that will be used by interns, because a lot of the staff members at the WISE are not very educated in what it takes. It will be used by them, by the parents, by anybody who will be in contact with them, and will be giving them instructions. So it's going to be consistent for everybody. And that will be also used by EPIC, who are going to be using it. So it's kind of instructional material that's going to be used not only in this program, but also by other programs.
Okay. So I guess
you're looking at the top question, and on purpose made it very broad so that you can see that that's kind of our first research question.
Right.
It's a part of a model.
Right.
And it starts with accessibility that's already being addressed. Mm-hmm. The second step is participation and adherence. What I just described, we hope that it will contribute to their adherence because of all the positive effects it has. They have more knowledge, they are going to be feeling more independent, so the independence, all that will motivate them to come back. So that's the adherence component. And the last part actually of this program is health and wellness, like really looking at their health, like their nutrition, what they do during the day, so the physical activity, behaviors in general during the day, and having kind of a place to go to discuss that. So that's a part of the model, but at the moment it's just a model. So for the NIH Foundation, we really want to just propose. We want to show them the model, that's where we're headed, but we're only going to propose that we want funding for the first and second level of the model. So they see, because this model was developed by NIH. This is not developed by Dr. Rimmer, and he will be reviewing our proposals, so we're really using both of inclusion and integration of these individuals.
And for the ACE, what I'm thinking you're saying is this.
Just
so
that.
Essentially, what you're going to me, it sounds like what you're doing is you're estimating the number of prompts and and time that it takes to get a small, convenient sample of your population to a level of success. And success you're defining as?
That they will actually potentially learn all the steps.
And who, like the instructor decides, you're good, I'm out.
What do you mean? Yeah, that will be by having them just go and use the videos without the instructor providing prompting.
Okay.
So once we see that they don't need any verbal, physical, or those two prompting, and they can follow the steps in the video on their own, which a lot of them are pretty good with because they like technology and they know assistive technology that way, then they will be on their own, and that will be the success of, that will be kind of, oh, you're on your own now.
Okay. You're gonna estimate the number of prompts and the number of times until these individuals can do these 2 or however many exercises you choose with the video alone.
Yeah, and we're going to look at how many steps they were able to perform with how much prompting at each of the sessions that we meet them. So the video is going to be used to administer how many sessions they were able to do independently.
Okay,
or with just the video.
And, walks
out
at the end doing the video, then that's done. But if somebody takes 15 times and then at that end point can use just the video, and then I guess the question is if nobody can get away with just using the video, certainly it sounds like they will be able to based on previous research.
Yeah, but the thing is that if they
at the end, who will be able to?
If we find that nobody is able to, that tells us about the strategy is not worth moving forward, right? It's too much to be developing 15 videos and then find that. But we may find that it just needs some verbal prompting, and that's sufficient for them to be more independent than be doing physically everything for them around the way. So there will be success in this study no matter what, because we're going to describe how they learn, right? We're going to describe their learning process. That's why multiple baseline single subject design is so important initially, because we want to look at each person individually rather than doing a group design, and all put in one bucket without seeing the learning curves, right?
Yeah, sort of behaviorist kind of adoption curve. Like you would.
Yeah. And potentially once we have this collective, we need to do a group design to see it's really, and then we're going off into different, like if they have physical disability in addition to ID, how does that change, right? Do we need to provide something else? Should the videos have a wheelchair in it because there's going to be a transfer onto the machine? So you're going into variations. It's not going to be a simple, process, but could they use just that simple video and by themselves actually be creative enough to think about, I know he sat down on the machine, so I'll just wheel down. Do we have to really have a video where we have a wheelchair with the person wheeling up from to the machine? I don't think so. So we'll maybe just see, would that work also for people with physical disabilities and things like that. So there's a lot of questions which we don't know until we really have this study done.
Just a question, very basic. When you say convenience sample, what is typical terminology that's often used? You mentioned that kind of with the line and this one. Is that a defined thing? That's basically,
Yeah, a convenience sample basically means you didn't. Like when asked this, I know for a fact our people are going to talk about this next week in a much smarter way than me. But if you're doing a random sample, it's pretty, even though it's random's pretty deliberate. You know what I mean? Random means you have a good sense of what is the whole population that you're trying to understand, and that you've mixed it up in a way that you've chosen the 5 most key people to represent the whole sample. That you, for some reason, know that the minimum you can do this on is 10. As opposed to convenience sampling, which is, often, it's if you were to try and make a lot of quantitative conclusions from a convenience sample, you're going to get hung. But what it tells your reader is, this is exploratory. I'm generating hypotheses. I don't necessarily know or, you know, it doesn't make sense from a feasibility standpoint to start with the population. So I'm just starting with what I can.
So in a way, our choice of VNA and XYZ territory is a convenient sample because we don't know all the data and statistics.
I've tried to use a randomized sample within a group. So for example, I would recruit 30 people and then I would randomly select people out of it and just revising a publication where the person said it's not really a random sample. I thought they did a pretty good job randomizing within the constraints of what I was given as the population. But it's still not considered random sample. You really have to have a large enough population to draw from blindly, kind of, in order for you to. A purposive sample is another one, but there's so many, like, in order for you to say that your sample was purposive, there's just so many strict rules for that.
Thank you.
So rather than try and push you guys through, we'll do your group research questions specifically.
Jamel's,
And
she is
Jamel's.
listening.
Oh, Jamel.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, see, it's not only the delay, it's the mute button. So Jamel, are you still there then? Hi.
I am still there. I can. The audio's a little off, but I think I'm catching most of everything that's being shared. So.
Okay. So since we didn't get to do everybody's research questions, specific games, we'll leave time next session to do yours and to do the Tastimals project.
Okay.
Does that sound good?
Hi.
Are you sure?
Yeah, that's fine. There's a delay, so forgive me if I'm hesitating. Yeah.
I understand. So, okay, that sounds good then. Thanks for hanging in there remotely.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.